Spiritual reason empaths are born into toxic families. Carl Jung. There's a pattern mainstream psychology refuses to acknowledge. A pattern so consistent, so statistically improbable, that it demands explanation beyond coincidence. And Carl Jung saw it decades before anyone was willing to name it. If you ask a room full of therapists, healers, empaths, and deeply sensitive people about their childhoods, something shocking emerges. Not some of them, most of them, will describe families marked by dysfunction, toxicity, narcissism, addiction, or violence. The very people who now dedicate their lives to understanding human consciousness, to holding space for others' pain, to healing the wounds of the world. They almost universally come from the darkest family systems. This isn't a small correlation. This is a thundering pattern that demands we ask a question most psychological frameworks won't touch. What if this isn't random? What if the most sensitive souls aren't accidentally born into the most toxic families but strategically placed there? Jung understood something that modern psychology has systematically avoided. He recognized that the psyche, what many would call the soul, operates with intention, that consciousness itself has purpose, and that before we arrive in these bodies, before we take our first breath, there may be a design at work that our rational minds struggle to comprehend. He wrote in his private journals about what he called the mystery of incarnation, the spiritual logic behind why certain souls choose certain circumstances, and buried in his work on the collective unconscious, on individuation, on the wounded healer archetype, is a theory that will completely reframe how you understand your own childhood. The theory is this: empaths, true empaths, not people who simply feel deeply, but those with genuinely porous psychic boundaries, are not randomly distributed across families. They are concentrated in the most dysfunctional systems. And this concentration is not cosmic cruelty, it's cosmic design. Let me be clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying your abuse was justified. I'm not saying your parents' toxicity was acceptable. I'm not suggesting you should feel grateful for trauma. What I am saying is that your soul, the conscious, eternal part of you that exists beyond this single lifetime, may have chosen this assignment. And that assignment came with a purpose so profound that understanding it will transform everything about how you see yourself. This video will reveal 7 spiritual reasons why empaths are born into toxic families. 7 reasons that Jung identified through decades of working with patients. 7 reasons that explain why you, yes, you watching this, may have been strategically placed in darkness, not as punishment, not as random suffering, but as a mission. And if you're an empath who grew up in chaos, dysfunction, or outright abuse, what I'm about to share will explain everything. It will explain why you felt different from your siblings, why you absorbed what they seemed immune to, why you couldn't turn off your sensitivity even when it was destroying you, why you became the family scapegoat, the black sheep, the identified patient, and most importantly, why you survived when part of you wonders how you possibly could have. Jung once wrote, "The meeting of 2 personalities is like the contact of 2 chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But what he was really describing was alchemy. And in the alchemical tradition, transformation doesn't happen in peaceful gardens. It happens in fire. It happens under pressure. It happens when volatile substances are forced together in conditions that would destroy lesser materials. You, as an empath born into toxicity, are the volatile substance placed into the alchemical vessel of a dysfunctional family. And what happens in that crucible, what you become because of it, is not accidental. It's the entire point. Before we go deeper, I need you to understand what we're really talking about when we use the word empath, because that term has been so diluted, so commercialized, so stripped of its true meaning that most people who call themselves empaths have no idea what genuine empathic sensitivity actually entails. And if you don't understand what you are, you can't understand why you were placed where you were placed. So let me ask you directly, have you ever walked into a room and immediately felt the emotional temperature, even when everyone was smiling? Have you ever known something was wrong with someone before they said a word? Have you ever absorbed someone else's anxiety, anger, or depression so completely that you couldn't tell where they ended and you began? Have you ever felt physically ill in the presence of certain people, even when they were perfectly polite? Have you ever been told you're too sensitive, too emotional, too much? Not because you were dramatic, but because you were actually registering realities that others were blind to? If you're nodding, if your chest is tightening with recognition, if you're thinking yes, exactly, always, then you know. You know what it means to have boundaries so porous that other people's inner worlds leak into yours. You know what it means to be a psychic receptor for energies and emotions that most people never consciously register. You know what it means to carry burdens that were never yours to begin with. And if you grew up in a toxic family with this level of sensitivity, you know something else. You know what it means to absorb a family's collective shadow, to become the emotional landfill for what everyone else refused to feel, to carry the rage, the shame, the terror, the grief that your family members disowned and projected onto you. You know what it means to be the one who couldn't pretend everything was fine because your nervous system was screaming the truth that everyone else had agreed to deny. This is what Jung was investigating when he noticed the pattern. He saw that the people who came to him with the deepest sensitivity, the most profound psychological awareness, the greatest capacity for consciousness, they were the ones who had survived the greatest darkness. And he began to ask, why? Why would the universe or God or the collective unconscious or whatever organizing intelligence govern soul placement, why would it send the most sensitive beings into the most brutal environments? The answer he arrived at was radical, and it's the answer we're going to explore across the next hour of this journey together. The answer is that empaths are not victims who happen to have spiritual gifts. Empaths are spiritual operatives who volunteered for a specific mission, to enter family systems that are trapped in unconscious cycles of trauma and dysfunction, and to do the one thing that can break those cycles, become conscious, to alchemize darkness into light, to transform inherited poison into medicine, to be the truth teller in a family of liars, to hold reality when everyone else has dissociated from it, to serve as the mirror that reflects what the family cannot bear to see in itself. These are not small assignments. These are not gentle tasks. These are the most difficult spiritual operations a soul can undertake, and they require a level of strength that most people will never have to access. Your sensitivity is not your weakness. Your sensitivity is the tool you needed to complete the assignment you chose before you were born. Now, I know some of you are bristling at this. I know some of you are thinking, I didn't choose this. No one would choose this. This is spiritual bypassing. This is victim blaming wrapped in mysticism. And I hear you, because there's a way of talking about soul contracts and spiritual assignments that absolutely does bypass the reality of trauma, that does minimize suffering, that does let abusers off the hook. So let me be absolutely clear. Your parents were still responsible for their behavior. The abuse was still wrong. You still deserved safety, love, and protection. Nothing I'm about to say negates that. What I'm offering is not an excuse for what was done to you. I'm offering an explanation for why your soul, not your child self, but your eternal consciousness, may have chosen to incarnate into those specific circumstances. This is the razor's edge we're going to walk together. Your childhood should never have happened the way it did, and your soul had a purpose for being there. The toxicity was unacceptable, and your placement there was strategic. You deserved infinitely better, and you became extraordinarily powerful because you didn't receive what you deserved. These are not contradictions. These are paradoxes, and paradox is the language of spiritual truth. Jung understood this. He wrote, "The foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering." But he also wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." What he meant was that some suffering is thrust upon us as a crucible for becoming, not because we deserve it, but because transformation requires heat. Over the next 7 chapters, I'm going to reveal the 7 spiritual reasons empaths are born into toxic families. Each reason is distinct, yet they weave together into a unified purpose. Some of you will recognize yourself in 1 or 2 of these reasons. Some of you will recognize yourself in all 7, because the most sensitive souls often carry multiple assignments simultaneously. These 7 reasons are: the family alchemist, who transmutes generational trauma; the truth teller, who breaks the family trance; the consciousness pioneer, who evolves the bloodline; the mirror, who reflects the family's hidden shadow; the sacrifice, who absorbs toxicity so siblings can survive; the sensitive receptor, who develops empathy as a survival mechanism; and the way shower, who learns darkness intimately in order to eventually guide others through it. By the end of this journey, you will understand which of these assignments you embodied. You will see your childhood through a completely different lens, and you will be offered a choice: to continue carrying the burden of your assignment, or to consciously complete it and reclaim your power. But before we begin exploring these 7 reasons, I need you to truly understand what an empath actually is. Not the Instagram definition, not the self-diagnosis that's become trendy, but the genuine psychological and spiritual condition that Jung was describing when he wrote about people with porous boundaries and heightened unconscious receptivity. Because if you don't understand the machinery of your own sensitivity, you won't understand why that machinery was necessary for the work you came to do. So let's begin with the truth about what you are. The word empath has been culturally appropriated. It's been turned into an identity badge, a personality type, a way to explain why you cry at movies or feel uncomfortable at parties. And while emotional sensitivity is real and valid, it is not the same as what Jung was describing when he identified people whose psychic boundaries were so porous that they literally absorbed the unconscious material of everyone around them. True empathy, in the Jungian sense, is not a preference. It's not a personality trait. It's a neurological and spiritual configuration that makes you fundamentally different from the majority of humans. And if you are genuinely empathic in this way, you didn't choose it. You were born wired differently. Let me tell you about Claire. Claire came to therapy at 28, convinced she was broken. She described a childhood where she would wake up in the middle of the night with crushing chest pain, only to discover the next morning that her mother had been lying awake 3 rooms away, silently raging. About Claire's father, Claire didn't hear anything. The house was silent, but her body registered her mother's emotional state so precisely that it manifested as physical symptoms in her own chest. As a child, Claire thought everyone experienced this. She assumed her siblings also felt the pressure waves of their father's irritation rippling through the house before he'd even spoken. She assumed everyone could sense the exact moment their mother's depression shifted from manageable to dangerous, even when her mother's face revealed nothing. It wasn't until her teenage years that Claire realized her siblings didn't feel any of this. They walked through the same house with the same parents and remained somehow insulated from the emotional weather that was constantly battering Claire's nervous system. This is what genuine empathic sensitivity looks like. It's not, "I understand how you feel." I am literally experiencing your emotional and energetic state inside my own body, and I cannot tell where you end and I begin. Jung called this porous boundaries. Modern neuroscience calls it high sensory processing sensitivity, combined with hyperactive mirror neuron systems and heightened interoceptive awareness. Spiritual traditions call it being energetically open or having thin veils between worlds. The language varies, but the phenomenon is consistent. Some people are psychically permeable in ways that make them extraordinarily receptive to the invisible dimension of reality, the realm of emotion, energy, intention, and consciousness that most people only dimly perceive. And when you are this permeable as a child in a toxic family, you don't have a superpower. You have a vulnerability that will shape everything about who you become. There are 4 primary types of empathic sensitivity, and understanding which ones you carry will help you make sense of your childhood experience. The first is emotional empathy. This is what Claire had, the direct, visceral absorption of other people's emotional states. When your mother was anxious, you became anxious, even if you had no reason to be. When your father was enraged, you felt rage coursing through your body, even if his anger wasn't directed at you. When your sibling was depressed, you sank into depression, even though your life circumstances were fine. Emotional empaths don't just understand others' emotions cognitively, they experience them somatically, as if the emotions were their own. The boundary between self and other becomes dangerously blurred. The second type is physical empathy. Physical empaths register others' bodily states in their own bodies. If your mother had a headache, you developed a headache. If your father's back was in pain, your back began to ache. Physical empaths often become hypochondriacs as children, constantly complaining of symptoms that don't have medical explanations, because the symptoms aren't theirs. They're absorbing the physical distress of family members. This type of empathy is particularly common in children with chronically ill or emotionally repressed parents. When parents can't or won't acknowledge their own pain, the empathic child's body starts expressing it for them. The third type is intuitive empathy. Intuitive empaths know things without information. They know their father is cheating before anyone discovers it. They know their mother is planning to leave before she's said a word. They know their sibling is in danger before the call comes. This type of empathy operates through the right hemisphere and unconscious processing. The empathic person is reading micro-expressions, vocal tones, energy shifts, and behavioral patterns at speeds far beyond conscious awareness, then delivering the conclusion as intuition or a feeling. In toxic families, intuitive empaths often become the family's unofficial truth-tellers, the ones who name realities everyone else is trying to ignore. The fourth type is environmental empathy. Environmental empaths are affected by spaces, places, and the residual energy of what has happened in those spaces. They walk into a room where there was a fight yesterday and feel agitated, even though the room is empty. They can't sleep in houses with bad energy. They become physically ill in hospitals, prisons, or places marked by collective trauma. For environmental empaths raised in toxic homes, the house itself becomes a source of constant low-grade distress. They feel the walls holding the memory of violence, the floors saturated with years of repressed rage, the very air thick with unprocessed grief. Many empaths have more than one of these types. Many have all 4. And if you're nodding, recognizing yourself, understanding for the first time why your childhood felt the way it did, this is important. Your empathic sensitivity is not pathology, it's neurology, and it's probably spiritual configuration. Jung wrote in his personal journals about what he called the sensitive ones, people whose psychological boundaries were so thin that they served as receivers for the collective unconscious. He believed these individuals were not accidents of neurology, but rather souls with specific capacities needed for the evolution of human consciousness. The sensitive ones, Jung argued, were the ones capable of bringing unconscious material into awareness, not just for themselves, but for entire systems. This is why your sensitivity, while it felt like a curse in childhood, was actually essential equipment for the mission you came to complete. But let's be honest about what this sensitivity cost you as a child, because there's a dangerous tendency in spiritual communities to romanticize empathic gifts, to talk about them as if they're superpowers, to suggest that being an empath is some elevated state of consciousness. And while empathy can become a gift when wielded consciously by a healed adult as a survival mechanism in a traumatized child, it's torture. When you're a child, you have no capacity to establish boundaries. You have no framework for distinguishing what's yours from what's theirs. You have no ability to shield yourself from the emotional onslaught of dysfunctional adults. You're just a raw receptor, absorbing everything, your nervous system overwhelmed by input you can't process, emotions you can't name, terrors you can't escape. And in a healthy family, empathic sensitivity might be manageable. A child might absorb parents' occasional stress or sadness, but would be anchored by their baseline love and stability. The empathic child in a healthy system learns that emotions pass, that adults can regulate themselves, that the world is fundamentally safe, even when it's temporarily uncomfortable. But in a toxic family, there is no baseline of safety. There is no regulation. There is only chaos, dysfunction, rage, addiction, narcissism, violence. And the empathic child is absorbing all of it all the time, with no capacity to metabolize it, no safe adult to help them make sense of it, no way to escape the psychic bombardment except to dissociate, which many empathic children learn to do. This is the brutal reality that spiritual bypassing ignores. Yes, your empathic sensitivity may have spiritual purpose, but that doesn't make what happened to you acceptable. You were a child. You deserved protection. And the fact that your soul may have chosen this assignment doesn't mean your child's self wasn't genuinely harmed by it. Jung understood this paradox. He wrote, "The unconscious mind of man sees correctly even when conscious reason is blind and impotent." What he meant was that there's a level of intelligence operating beneath our rational awareness, what many would call soul intelligence, that understands things the conscious mind cannot. Your soul may have understood that this toxic family was the training ground you needed, but your child self only understood terror, confusion, and pain. Both realities are true, and we have to honor both. Now, here's what makes empaths in toxic families even more vulnerable. You became the family's emotional landfill. Because your sensitivity meant you couldn't help but absorb what others were feeling, and because the family unconsciously recognized that you could carry what they could not, they began using you as a psychic dumping ground. Your mother couldn't acknowledge her rage, so it went into you. Your father couldn't face his shame, so it landed in you. Your siblings couldn't process their fear, so you carried it for them. And because you were a child with porous boundaries, you had no choice but to receive all of it. You became the designated container for the family's collective shadow. All the emotions, truths, and realities they refused to acknowledge in themselves. This is what therapists call being the identified patient, or the scapegoat. But those clinical terms don't capture the spiritual mechanism at play. What was actually happening was that your empathic system was doing exactly what it was designed to do: receive, hold, and process psychic material. The problem was that you were receiving toxic material at volumes no child could possibly process. It's like being given a water purification system and then having sewage pumped through it at industrial speeds. The purification system isn't faulty, it's just being asked to do something It was never meant to handle at that scale, that young, that unsupported. And this is where we begin to touch the edge of why empaths are placed in toxic families. Because that purification system, your empathic sensitivity, wasn't given to you randomly. It was given to you specifically because there was something in your family system that needed to be purified, something that needed to be brought into consciousness, something that needed to be transformed. You weren't born empathic and then randomly ended up in a toxic family. You were born empathic because you were going into a toxic family. The sensitivity was preparation for the environment. The tool matched the task. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand the spiritual reasons for your placement, we need to fully grasp what your empathic nature made you capable of and what it made you vulnerable to. Here's what most people don't understand about empaths. You don't just feel more deeply than others. You process reality through an entirely different channel. While most people rely primarily on cognitive processing, thinking, analyzing, reasoning, you rely on energetic and emotional processing. You sense truth through your body and nervous system before your mind catches up. You know things before you know why you know them. This is why empaths are so often gaslit in toxic families. When you say something feels wrong and your family responds with, "You're imagining things," or "You're too sensitive," or "That's not happening," they're not just invalidating your perception. They're invalidating your primary processing channel. It's like telling someone who sees color that they're imagining the red, that everything is actually gray, they're just being dramatic, except you're not imagining it. Your empathic system is registering real data, micro expressions, vocal tones, energetic shifts, unconscious cues that others aren't consciously tracking. You're operating with a different sensory apparatus, and in a healthy environment, this would be validated and refined into a genuine gift. But in a toxic family, your empathic accuracy becomes a threat because you see what they're hiding. You feel what they're denying. You register the reality beneath the performance. And toxic family systems require that everyone participate in the agreed-upon delusion. They require that you pretend the emperor is clothed, that you smile and say everything's fine when it's falling apart, that you accept the official narrative even when it contradicts everything your nervous system is screaming. And as an empath, you can't do that. Your body won't let you. You can pretend with your words, you can try to play along, but your nervous system rebels. You develop anxiety, depression, panic attacks, physical illness, because you're being forced to deny your primary processing channel. You're being required to unsee what you see, unfeel what you feel, unknow what you know. This is crazy-making in the most literal sense. And it's why so many empaths who grew up in toxic families end up in therapy, convinced they're mentally ill, when what they actually are is psychologically intact people who were forced to doubt their own perceptions for survival. Claire, the woman I told you about earlier, spent years in therapy trying to fix her anxiety. Therapist after therapist treated her panic attacks as a disorder to be medicated. But what finally healed Claire wasn't medication. It was validation. It was a therapist who finally said, "You're not anxious, you're empathic, and you were absorbing your family's disowned emotions for decades. Your panic attacks weren't mental illness. They were your nervous system trying to expel what wasn't yours." The moment Claire heard this, something shifted. She wasn't broken. She was sensitive. And her sensitivity had been weaponized against her by a family system that needed her to carry what they couldn't face. This is the truth I need you to hear. If you're an empath who grew up in toxicity, you are not damaged. You are not defective. You are not too sensitive or too much or mentally ill because you couldn't handle absorbing your family's collective shadow as a child. You are a person with heightened nervous system sensitivity who was placed in an environment that exploited that sensitivity without consent, support, or acknowledgement. And the reason you were placed there, the spiritual logic beneath it all, is what we're going to explore next. Because now that you understand what you are, we can begin to understand why you were chosen for this particular mission. Jung wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." And this is the pivot point. You didn't choose your family. You didn't choose your empathic wiring, but you are now in a position to choose what you do with both. You can remain trapped in victimhood, seeing your sensitivity as a curse and your childhood as random suffering. Or you can begin to see the pattern, the design, the intelligence operating beneath the surface of your pain. And once you see it, everything changes. So let's begin with the first spiritual reason empaths are born into toxic families. Let's explore the role of the family alchemist, the soul who is placed in darkness specifically to transform it. In medieval alchemy, there was a concept called nigredo, the blackening. It was the first stage of transformation where base materials were burned, broken down, dissolved into darkness. The alchemist would take lead, sulfur, mercury, crude, poisonous substances and subject them to fire, to dissolution, to processes that looked like destruction. And only after this descent into blackness could the materials be purified, refined, eventually transmuted into gold. The alchemists understood something that modern psychology is only beginning to rediscover. Transformation requires descent. Healing requires contact with poison. Gold is made from lead, not by avoiding the darkness, but by entering it with consciousness. You, as an empath, born into a toxic family, are the alchemist. And your family is the nigredo, the poisonous material you were given to transform. This is the first spiritual reason for your placement. You are a family alchemist. You were born into your specific lineage because there was generational trauma embedded in that bloodline that could not be transformed by unconscious people. It required someone with your specific sensitivity, your specific capacity for consciousness, your specific willingness at the soul level to descend into the family's inherited darkness and metabolize it. Let me explain what I mean by generational trauma, because this concept is central to understanding your role. Jung's most revolutionary idea was the collective unconscious, the theory that beneath our personal unconscious minds, there exists a shared psychic substrate connecting all of humanity. But Jung also recognized that within the collective unconscious, there are smaller pools: family unconscious, cultural unconscious, ancestral unconscious. And within these pools, trauma accumulates. When your great-grandmother experienced something she couldn't process, abuse, war, starvation, loss, that unprocessed trauma didn't disappear when she died. It lived on in the psychic field of the family. It was passed down not through stories but through energy, through the unconscious transmission of fear, shame, rage, grief. Her children absorbed it without knowing why they felt the way they felt, and their children absorbed it, and their children. Until someone in the line had the consciousness to finally feel it, face it, and transform it. Modern epigenetics is now proving what Jung intuited. Trauma alters DNA. The children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors show measurable changes in their genetic expression related to stress response. The descendants of enslaved people carry biological markers of their ancestors' trauma. The science is catching up to the spiritual truth. We inherit more than eye color and bone structure. We inherit the unprocessed psychic material of everyone who came before us. And most people carry this inheritance unconsciously. They experience anxiety, depression, rage, or terror without knowing why. They repeat patterns they swore they'd never repeat. They find themselves trapped in the same dynamics that destroyed their parents and their parents' parents, going back generations. But empaths can't carry trauma unconsciously. Your sensitivity won't allow it. When you absorb ancestral pain, you feel it. It moves through your body, your nervous system, your dreams. It demands to be acknowledged. And this is why you were chosen, because your empathic nature means you cannot pass trauma down unfelt. You are forced to confront it, and in confronting it, you have the opportunity to transform it. Let me tell you about Maya. Maya came from a Jewish family that survived the Holocaust. Her grandparents made it out of the camps, immigrated to America, and did what many survivors did. They never spoke about it. They built successful lives, raised children, presented themselves as happy and functional. But Maya's mother, their daughter, was haunted by inexplicable panic attacks, agoraphobia, and a terror of authority figures she couldn't explain. And Maya, from childhood, felt a dread so profound she thought she was dying. As a young child, Maya would wake up in the night, unable to breathe, convinced soldiers were coming for her. She had nightmares about trains, camps, gas chambers, images she'd never seen, stories she'd never been told. Her parents thought she was watching too much television. Therapists diagnosed anxiety disorder. Maya felt insane. It wasn't until her grandmother died and the family finally began speaking about the Holocaust that Maya realized the dread she'd been carrying her entire life wasn't hers. It was her grandmother's. It was her great-grandfather's who died in the camps. It was the collective terror of a family that had been hunted, starved, dehumanized. Trauma so massive it couldn't be held by one person. So it spilled into the next generation and the next until it landed in Maya. And here's what's crucial. Maya's siblings didn't feel this. They knew their family history, but it remained historical information, something terrible that happened to other people in another time. Maya alone absorbed it viscerally because Maya was empathic, because Maya's nervous system was porous enough to register the ancestral field, because Maya was the family alchemist, and so began the most difficult work of Maya's life. Grief work for losses she never personally experienced. Rage work for injustices she never personally endured. Terror work for threats that no longer existed in her present reality. She had to feel it all, metabolize it all, give it consciousness, language, movement. She had to let the unprocessed trauma of 3 generations move through her body until it was finally complete. This is what alchemists do. They take the poisonous material, the grief, rage, terror, shame that previous generations couldn't bear to feel, and they process it. They bring consciousness to what was unconscious. They give voice to what was silenced. They cry the tears that were never cried. They scream the rage that was swallowed. They shake with the terror that was frozen, and in doing so, they transform it. The trauma that entered the lineage as poison exits as wisdom. The suffering that was passed down unconsciously is finally metabolized. The curse becomes medicine. This is the transmutation theory. Suffering absorbed plus consciousness as healing, not just for you, but for the entire lineage, backward and forward. When you, as an empath, consciously process inherited trauma, you're not just healing yourself. You're completing grief work for ancestors who died with their pain unfelt. You're breaking patterns that have repeated for generations. You're liberating your descendants from carrying what you've transformed. One conscious person in a lineage can heal backward through time and forward into futures that haven't yet arrived. But here's what makes this role almost unbearable. The family rarely understands what you're doing. More often they reject it, because the process of transmutation requires you to name what previous generations denied. You have to say, our family has rage, our family has shame, our family has violence in its history, and toxic families cannot tolerate truth-telling. They've survived by pretending, by maintaining the illusion of normalcy. And you, the alchemist, shatter that illusion simply by feeling what they've all agreed not to feel. So you become the problem, the sick one, the crazy one, the too sensitive one. Your family looks at you with your anxiety, your depression, your emotional intensity, and they say, "What's wrong with you? Why can't you just be normal? Everyone else is fine." And they genuinely believe this because they've successfully dissociated from the pain you're absorbing. They don't understand that you're not sick. You're sensitive enough to register the family's collective illness. You're not broken. You're the one trying to repair what's been broken for generations. You're not too much. You're the only one feeling appropriate amounts of emotion for what has actually happened in this lineage. Jung wrote, "The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate." What he meant was that unprocessed trauma doesn't disappear. It manifests. It creates patterns. It drives behavior. It becomes destiny until someone becomes conscious enough to intercept it. You are that someone. You're the interception point, the place where the unconscious pattern of your family line finally meets consciousness. And this is why the family alchemist is so often scapegoated. You're disrupting the system's equilibrium. Toxic families maintain stability through unconsciousness. Everyone agrees to pretend, to minimize, to carry on. But you can't pretend. Your empathic nature won't allow it. So your very existence, your symptoms, your truth-telling, your refusal to participate in the family delusion threatens the fragile structure they've built. They need you to be the problem because if you're not the problem, they have to face that the family system itself is the problem. They need you to be sick because if you're not sick, they have to acknowledge that the family is sick. They need you to carry the pathology because otherwise they'd have to look at their own. This is called designated carrier in family systems theory. One person holds the illness so the system can maintain the illusion of health. And empaths, because of their sensitivity, end up in this role not by choice, but by psychic default. You absorb what they won't feel. You express what they've repressed. You become the symptom bearer for the whole family's dysfunction. But what the family doesn't understand, and what you may not have understood until now, is that this role, while painful, is also sacred, because you're not just absorbing trauma, you're transforming it. The fact that it moves through you, that you feel it, that you become conscious of it, this is the healing. You are the alchemical vessel where the family's poison is being turned into medicine. And here's the profound part. You don't have to do anything other than feel it consciously. You don't have to fix your family. You don't have to make them understand. You don't have to get their acknowledgement or approval. The transmutation happens simply because you're feeling what they won't feel, naming what they won't name, processing what they've left unprocessed. Your consciousness is the alchemical fire, and everything you pass through that fire changes. Now, I need to address something crucial here, because there's a dangerous way this truth can be twisted. This does not mean your abuse was acceptable. This does not mean your trauma was meant to happen. This does not mean you should feel grateful for suffering. What happened to you as a child was not okay. Your parents' dysfunction was not justified by your soul's contract. The fact that you're transforming poison into medicine doesn't make it okay that you were given poison in the first place. The spiritual assignment is what your soul did with the experience, not justification for the experience itself. You are an alchemist because you took what should never have happened and chose to transform it rather than pass it on. That's your power. That's your heroism. But it doesn't absolve your family of responsibility for what they put you through. Jung understood this paradox. He wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." He wasn't glorifying pain. He was stating a mechanism. Transformation requires contact with difficult material, but the pain itself is not the point. Every toxic family operates on a foundation of lies. not necessarily spoken lies, but structural ones, the agreed-upon false narratives that hold the dysfunctional system together. These are what Jung called family myths, and they function like collective hypnosis. Everyone in the system tacitly agrees to believe them, to perform them, to never question them. And as long as the trance holds, the family can continue functioning in its dysfunction without ever having to face reality. We're a happy family. Dad doesn't have a drinking problem. Mom's just stressed, not abusive. We don't talk about that. Everything's fine. These myths create a shared hallucination, a consensual delusion that allows everyone to avoid the terror of seeing what's actually happening. And in most families, this system works. Most children absorb the mythology without question. They sense something's wrong, but they accept the official narrative. They learn to unsee what they see, unfeel what they feel, to prioritize the family's version of reality over their own direct experience. But empaths can't do this. And this brings us to the second spiritual reason you were placed in your toxic family. You are the truth teller. You were sent to break the trance. Your nervous system won't allow you to participate in collective delusion. When everyone is pretending everything's fine, your body is screaming that it's not. When everyone is maintaining the pleasant facade, your empathic receptors are registering the rage, shame, and terror beneath it. When everyone is telling you that didn't happen or you're imagining things, your direct experience is telling you the opposite. And because you can't reconcile the dissonance between the family mythology and your lived reality, you become the problem. You become what family systems therapists call the identified patient, the person whose symptoms reveal the family's illness. Or you become the black sheep, the one who won't play along, who asks the wrong questions, who names what everyone has agreed not to name. Let me tell you about David. David grew up in what looked like a successful upper-middle-class family. His father was a respected attorney. His mother was active in church and community organizations. His two older siblings were high achievers, straight-A students, athletes, popular. From the outside, they were the ideal American family. Inside the house, David's father was a tyrant. He didn't hit them. The abuse was subtler than that. It was control, humiliation, criticism so cutting it left psychological scars deeper than bruises. If David got a B, he was interrogated about why he wasn't smart enough for an A. If he showed emotion, he was mocked as weak. If he expressed an opinion that differed from his father's, he was dressed down in front of the family until he recanted. But here's what made David's situation so crazy-making. No one acknowledged this. His mother would smile through dinner as his father eviscerated David's self-worth, then later tell David he was too sensitive, that his father was just trying to help him succeed. His siblings would witness the abuse, then later act like nothing had happened. The next day, his father would be pleasant, even affectionate, as if the previous night's psychological torture had never occurred. And David, as a young child, tried to accept the official narrative. He tried to believe that this was normal, that he was too sensitive, that his father's behavior was for his own good. But his nervous system wouldn't accept it. He developed severe anxiety. He couldn't sleep. He started having panic attacks before dinner because he never knew which father would show up, the charming attorney or the cruel tyrant. By age 14, David was in therapy, and here's where it gets particularly insidious. The therapist, after one family session, where everyone presented as loving and concerned, diagnosed David with anxiety disorder and prescribed medication. The problem was located in David. The family system remained unexamined. It wasn't until David was in his mid-20s in a different therapist's office that someone finally said, "David, you're not mentally ill. You're the only one in your family telling the truth. Your anxiety isn't a disorder. It's your nervous system's appropriate response to psychological abuse, that everyone else is pretending isn't happening. This moment shattered David, and it freed him, because for the first time someone had validated what his empathic system had been screaming for 25 years. The emperor has no clothes. The family is not fine. What you're experiencing is real. This is the truth teller's burden. You are the only one who cannot participate in the collective delusion, and toxic families require unanimous participation in the mythology. They need everyone to pretend. They need everyone to maintain the facade. Because if even one person says, wait, this is abuse, this is dysfunction, this is not okay, the entire structure collapses. So when you, as an empath, name the reality that everyone else is denying, you're not just speaking truth. You're committing an act of violence against the family system itself. You're breaking the trance, and the family will punish you for it. This is why truth tellers are so often scapegoated, pathologized, or expelled from the family, not because they're wrong, but because they're right. And their rightness is unbearable to a system built on lies. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And toxic families will do anything to avoid facing their own dysfunction. They will gaslight you. They will rewrite history. They will tell you you're crazy, oversensitive, ungrateful, mentally ill. They will perform elaborate rituals of normalcy, holidays, celebrations, family photos, to prove to themselves and the world that everything is fine. And they will sacrifice you, the truth teller, to maintain that illusion. But here's what you need to understand about your role. You're not being punished because you're wrong. You're being punished because your nervous system has integrity, because you cannot pretend, because your empathic nature means you register reality at a level most people can successfully ignore. And this integrity, this inability to participate in delusion, is precisely why you were placed in this family. Because someone had to hold reality, someone had to be the anchor. Someone had to remain sane in an insane system. In Jungian psychology, there's a concept called the integration of opposites. Jung believed that psychological health required holding contradictions in consciousness, acknowledging both light and shadow, both good and evil, both the persona we present and the reality we hide. But most people can't tolerate this. Most people split reality into all good or all bad, maintaining comfortable narratives by denying what contradicts them. Toxic families are expert splitters. They maintain the mythology of being a good family by disowning all evidence to the contrary. They are not abusive, they're just strict. They're not neglectful, they're just busy. They're not dysfunctional, they're just complicated. Every piece of contrary evidence is minimized, rationalized, or projected onto the person pointing it out. And you, as the truth teller, are the one forcing integration. You're the one saying, we can be loving sometimes and abusive sometimes. Both are true. You're the one refusing to split reality into comfortable narratives. You're holding the contradiction. And this is spiritually advanced work that most people will never do. The family experiences this as betrayal, but what you're actually doing is offering them an opportunity for wholeness. By naming the shadow they're denying, you're inviting them toward integration, toward consciousness, toward truth. They almost never accept this invitation, but you extend it nonetheless, simply by existing as someone who cannot pretend. Now, let's be clear about what this costs you. Because the price of being the truth teller is exile, not always physical exile, though many truth tellers do get ejected from their families eventually, but psychological and emotional exile. You become the outsider, the one who doesn't fit, the one who ruins everything with your negativity, or your dredging up the past, or your inability to just let things go. Family gatherings become performances, where you're expected to pretend along with everyone else. You're supposed to smile in the family photo, to laugh at dad's jokes, to act like everything's normal. And if you can't, if your face betrays discomfort, if you decline to participate in the charade, you're accused of being difficult, of holding grudges, of not being able to move on. But here's what they're really saying. Why won't you participate in our delusion? Why won't you help us maintain the lie? Why won't you sacrifice your reality for our comfort? And the answer is, because you can't. Your nervous system won't allow it. Your empathic nature has given you what I call psychic allergies to bullshit. You can smell deception even when it's unspoken. You can feel the dissonance between performance and reality, and your body rebels against participating in it. This isn't a choice you're making. This is how you're wired, and it's why you were chosen for this role. Because here's the spiritual mechanism at work. Toxic families are consciousness desserts. They're systems where everyone has agreed to remain unconscious, to avoid self-examination, to never look at their shadow material. And consciousness cannot evolve in such an environment. The patterns repeat. The dysfunction perpetuates. The trauma gets passed down generation after generation because no one will name it. Until you arrive. You with your inconvenient truth-telling. You with your inability to participate in the mythology. You with your insistence on reality. And even if the family rejects you, even if they scapegoat you, exile you, cut you off, you have served your function. Because you have introduced consciousness into an unconscious system. You have named what was unnameable. You have made visible what was hidden. And that changes the field. Even if they never acknowledge it, even if they spend the rest of their lives trying to prove you wrong. The truth has been spoken, and once spoken, it cannot be fully unspoken. Jung wrote about what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to hold opposites in tension until a new level of consciousness emerges. The truth-teller serves this function for the family system. You hold the tension between the mythology and the reality. You refuse to collapse into either family is all good or family is all bad. You maintain the complexity. You are my parents and you harmed me. I love you and I see your dysfunction. We have good memories and we have trauma. Both are true. This is enormously sophisticated psychological work, and most families cannot tolerate it. They need you to choose. Either pretend everything is fine or be completely cut off. Either participate in the delusion or be cast out. They cannot handle your both and consciousness. They need either or simplicity. But you, as an empath, cannot give them that simplicity. You see too clearly, you feel too much, you know too much, and so you remain in the tension, holding the truth even when it isolates you. And here's what I need you to understand. This isolation is not punishment, it's initiation. You are being separated from the unconscious collective so that you can develop independent consciousness. You are being forced out of the family trance so that you can see clearly. You are being exiled from the tribe so that you can find your own truth. In indigenous cultures, there's a tradition of the vision quest. The young person who must leave the village, go into the wilderness alone, and face themselves without the buffer of collective identity. They are separated from everything familiar so they can discover who they are beneath the roles they've been given. This is what's happening to you. Your truth-telling has ejected you from the comfortable mythology of family belonging. And in that exile, painful as it is, you have the opportunity to discover who you actually are, not who your family needed you to be, not the role you were assigned. In their dysfunction, but your authentic self. The family sees this as your failure. Why can't you just be normal? Why can't you just fit in? But spiritually, this is your success. You have refused assimilation into unconsciousness. You have chosen truth over belonging. And while that choice brings loneliness, it also brings something more valuable. Integrity. You become whole, not comfortable but whole. Not accepted, but authentic. not loved by everyone, but honest with yourself. And here's the paradox. By refusing to carry the family's lies, you actually free them, not immediately, not in ways they'll acknowledge, but energetically you remove yourself from the position of designated lie maintainer. You stop propping up their delusions with your participation. You stop enabling their unconsciousness by pretending along with them. And when you step out of that role, something shifts. Sometimes the family's dysfunction escalates because they've lost their scapegoat. Sometimes they find a new person to carry the projected problem. Sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, your truth-telling plants a seed that grows years later into their own awakening. But none of that is your responsibility. Your responsibility was simply to tell the truth, to name what you saw, to refuse the delusion. And you have done that, whether they accepted it or not. David, the man I told you about earlier, he eventually stopped going to family gatherings. He set a boundary that his parents experienced as betrayal. I won't participate in pretending this family is healthy. If you want a relationship with me, it has to include acknowledgement of what happened. If you can't do that, I understand. But I can't sacrifice my reality anymore. His family chose the delusion. They cut him off, told extended family he was troubled and had issues, maintained their mythology of being a loving family with one inexplicably ungrateful son. It was painful for David, the loss was real, but so was his freedom. Years later, his younger sister reached out. She'd started having panic attacks, started therapy, started remembering, and she said to David, "I always knew you were telling the truth. I just wasn't strong enough to say it." She thanked him for being the one who named reality, even though she'd been too afraid to validate him at the time. This is what truth-tellers do. They plant seeds of consciousness that may not sprout until years later. They create cracks in the mythology that others eventually walk through. They pay the price of exile so that others might eventually find the courage to speak their own truth. But even if no one ever thanks you, even if your family never acknowledges what you saw and named, the work is still complete. Because you served your function. You broke the trance. You introduced consciousness. You refused complicity with delusion. And Jung would say, this is the highest spiritual work a person can do. To choose truth over comfort, reality over illusion, consciousness over unconsciousness, even when the cost is belonging itself. You are not the family problem. You are the family truth-teller. And that is a sacred, lonely, essential role that only the strongest souls can carry. The question now is, having told the truth, having broken the trance, having refused the delusion, what do you do with the exile that follows? How do you build a life outside the mythology? How do you find belonging when you've been cast out for seeing clearly? That's the work of individuation. That's the journey from truth-teller to autonomous adult. And it's the work you're already doing, simply by questioning why your family felt the way it did, why you couldn't pretend the way everyone else could. You are not broken, you are awake. And awakening in an unconscious family will always look like pathology to those who are still asleep. But you know better now. You know what you actually are. You're the one who held reality when everyone else dissociated from it. You're the one who maintained integrity when everyone else chose delusion. You're the one who told the truth when silence would have been easier. And that makes you not the problem. That makes you the hero of your own story. There is a concept in evolutionary biology called punctuated equilibrium, the idea that species don't evolve gradually over time, but rather remain stable for long periods, then suddenly leap to a new level of complexity when conditions demand it. One organism mutates, adapts, develops new capacities, and that single individual becomes the bridge between what the species was and what it's becoming. You are that organism, not biologically but consciously. You are the evolutionary leap in your family line. This brings us to the third spiritual reason empaths are born into toxic families. You are the consciousness pioneer, the first person in your bloodline to wake up, the first to develop self-awareness, the first to see the patterns, the first to choose differently, the first to break the cycle of unconscious repetition that has governed your family for generations. And this is not a small thing. This is you changing the entire trajectory of your lineage, backward into your ancestry and forward into descendants you may never meet. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming a conscious, autonomous individual separate from the collective. But when you individuate within a family system, you're not just separating from your personal family. You're separating from generations of unconscious patterning. You're the first one to question behaviors that everyone else simply accepted as how things are. You're the first one to say, "This ends with me." Let me explain what unconscious families look like, because if you're watching this, you probably grew up in one, but you may not have language for what you experienced. Unconscious families operate on autopilot. They repeat patterns without examination. If grandmother was an alcoholic, mother becomes an alcoholic, daughter becomes an alcoholic, not because of genetics alone, but because no one ever became conscious enough to interrupt the pattern. If grandfather was violent, father is violent, son is violent, not because violence is inherited, but because no one ever developed enough awareness to choose differently. These families don't learn from their mistakes because they don't acknowledge their mistakes. They don't grow because they don't reflect. They don't change because they don't see that change is possible. They simply repeat, generation after generation, the same dynamics, the same addictions, the same abuse, the same dysfunction. It's like watching a movie stuck on a loop. The characters keep making the same choices, experiencing the same consequences, suffering the same pain. But because they're not conscious, they don't recognize the pattern. Each generation thinks their situation is unique, that their problems are different from their parents' problems, even as they're living out identical scripts. And this unconscious repetition would continue indefinitely, except for one thing. Eventually, someone in the line wakes up. Someone becomes conscious. Someone sees the pattern, and everything changes. You are that someone. Let me tell you about Sarah. Sarah came from 5 generations of alcoholic mothers. Her great-great-grandmother drank. Her great-grandmother drank. Her grandmother drank. Her mother drank. And by the time Sarah was 22, she was drinking, not socially, not occasionally, daily, heavily, in the same way her mother had, in the same way her mother's mother had. But here's what was different about Sarah. She noticed, she saw the pattern, she made the connection. And one night, drunk and alone in her apartment, she had a moment of clarity that would change her entire lineage. I am living my mother's life. I am becoming my mother, and my mother lived her mother's life. This has been happening for 5 generations, and if I don't stop it, I will pass it to my daughter. The cycle will continue, unless I choose differently. That moment, that recognition, was the beginning of Sarah's individuation. She got sober, she went to therapy, she did the brutal work of examining every pattern she'd inherited, every unconscious behavior she'd absorbed, every way she was living someone else's script instead of her own life. And it was harder than anything she'd ever done, because consciousness comes with a cost. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize how much of your behavior is inherited, you have to decide whether to continue or to change. And change, genuine change, requires you to separate from the family system entirely. Sarah's mother couldn't understand why Sarah stopped drinking. In her mother's mind, drinking was just what women in their family did. It was normal. It was how you coped with stress, with boredom, with life. Sarah's sobriety felt like judgment, like rejection, like Sarah claiming she was better than the rest of the family. And in a way, Sarah was claiming exactly that, not morally better, but consciously different. Sarah had chosen to become aware, and awareness created separation. This is the burden of the consciousness pioneer. You can't wake up without leaving others behind. You can't evolve without outgrowing your family of origin. You can't become conscious without seeing how unconscious everyone else still is. And that seeing creates a chasm that no amount of love can fully bridge. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And this is precisely what happens in unconscious families. People believe they have no choice. They believe their alcoholism, their rage, their depression, their dysfunction is just how they are, as if it's genetic destiny, as if they're powerless to be different. But you, as the consciousness pioneer, see through this. You recognize that what your family calls fate is actually pattern. What they call just how I am is actually learned behavior. What they experience as inevitable is actually choice. It's just that they've been choosing unconsciously. And once you see this, you can't participate in the mythology of powerlessness anymore. You can't pretend that change is impossible. You can't accept "this is just how our family is" as an excuse for repeating harm. You become what family systems therapists call the differentiated individual, someone who can remain connected to the family without being absorbed by its dysfunction. Someone who can love family members without inheriting their patterns. Someone who can honor the past without being controlled by it. But differentiation is terrifying to unconscious families, because your consciousness reveals their unconsciousness. Your choice to change reveals their choice to stay the same. Your evolution reveals their stagnation. And rather than being inspired by your transformation, they often feel threatened by it. This is why consciousness pioneers are so frequently rejected by their families, not because they've done something wrong, but because they've done something different. And difference in an unconscious system is experienced as betrayal. Sarah's mother stopped speaking to her. Her grandmother told her she was abandoning her heritage. Her sisters accused her of thinking she was too good for the family. None of them could understand that Sarah wasn't rejecting them. She was rejecting the pattern. She wasn't abandoning her heritage. She was transforming it. But unconscious people can't make that distinction. To them, you are the family. There is no separation between the person and the pattern. So when you reject the dysfunction, they experience it as you rejecting them. And here's where the spiritual dimension becomes crucial. You are not just changing your own life. You are changing the entire lineage. This is what Jung called the long body, the idea that we are not isolated individuals, but rather nodes in an ancestral continuum. What you heal in yourself, you heal backward through time in your ancestors. What you transform in your own life, you prevent from being passed forward to your descendants. Sarah's sobriety didn't just free Sarah, it freed her future children from inheriting 5 generations of alcoholism. It honored her grandmother and great-grandmother by completing the healing work they couldn't do themselves. It changed the trajectory of a family line that had been caught in the same loop for over a century. This is what I call the lineage pivot point. You are the hinge, where your family's story changes direction. Before you, unconscious repetition. After you, conscious choice. You are the breakthrough moment in a multi-generational pattern, and that is extraordinarily powerful. But it's also extraordinarily isolating, because you're the first. You don't have a model for how to be conscious in an unconscious family. You don't have an example of someone who broke the pattern successfully. You're pioneering. You're creating a path that didn't exist before you walked it. And pioneers are always lonely. They're always misunderstood. They're always ahead of the collective. But they're also essential. Without pioneers, nothing evolves. Without the first person to choose differently, patterns repeat forever. Jung understood this deeply. His entire theory of individuation was about becoming the first to integrate your shadow, the first to question your persona, the first to examine your unconscious motivations. He wrote extensively about how painful and isolating this process is, but he also wrote about how necessary it is, not just for the individual, but for the collective. Because when one person individuates, they create a template. They prove that change is possible. They demonstrate that consciousness can emerge from unconsciousness. And even if their family rejects them, even if their family never acknowledges what they've done, they've still shifted the field. They've still introduced new possibilities into a system that believed no alternatives existed. Sarah will probably never receive recognition from her family for breaking 5 generations of alcoholism. Her mother will probably die believing Sarah was ungrateful and difficult. Her sisters will probably continue drinking, continue the pattern, maybe even intensify it out of resentment towards Sarah's different choice. But Sarah's daughter, if Sarah chooses to have children, will grow up in a different reality. She won't inherit addiction as destiny. She won't learn that drinking is how women cope. She won't absorb the belief that change is impossible. She'll have a mother who demonstrates consciousness, choice, transformation, and maybe Sarah's daughter will have her own struggles. Maybe she'll have patterns to break that Sarah couldn't see, but she'll be starting from a different place. She'll be building on Sarah's foundation. She'll be the second generation of consciousness in a lineage that had been unconscious for at least 5. This is what evolutionary leaps look like. Not smooth, gradual progress, but sudden emergence. One person becoming conscious, and everything after them being different. Because they existed, you are that person, whether your family sees it or not, whether they acknowledge it or not, whether they appreciate it or not. You have chosen consciousness in a lineage of unconsciousness. You have chosen examination in a family that avoided self-reflection. You have chosen change in a system that demanded repetition. And that choice, that simple, brutal, courageous choice to become aware, has transformed your entire bloodline. It has completed healing work for ancestors who couldn't do it themselves. It has prevented trauma from being passed to descendants who haven't been born yet. It has broken a cycle that might have continued for 5 more generations if you hadn't had the strength to stop it. This is not a small thing. This is you altering destiny itself, not fate, because fate is unconscious, but destiny, because destiny is what becomes possible when consciousness enters the picture. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And for the consciousness pioneer, becoming who you truly are requires rejecting who your family needed you to be. It requires outgrowing the roles you were assigned. It requires choosing your own path, even when that path leads away from everyone you've ever known. That's terrifying, that's lonely, that's brutal, but it's also the only way consciousness evolves. Someone has to be first. Someone has to pioneer. Someone has to pay the cost of transformation so that others might someday have it easier. And you have done that. You are doing that. Right now, simply by questioning these patterns, you are continuing the work. You are still pioneering. You are still choosing consciousness, even when unconsciousness would be more comfortable. Do not underestimate what you've accomplished simply by refusing to repeat what you inherited. Do not minimize the courage it takes to be the first. Do not dismiss the spiritual magnitude of being the turning point in a multi-generational story. You are not just surviving your childhood, you are evolving your lineage. And that makes you not a victim, but a transformer, not damaged, but extraordinary. Not the weak link, but the strongest soul your family line has ever produced. Because it takes tremendous strength to be the first one awake. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is everything about ourselves that we cannot accept. The rage we're not supposed to feel, the weakness we're not allowed to show, The desires we're taught to shame. The truths we've learned to hide. The shadow is not evil, it's simply disowned. It's the parts of ourselves we've exiled to the unconscious because acknowledging them would threaten our self-image or our acceptance by others. And here's what Jung discovered. What we refuse to see in ourselves, we see everywhere else. What we cannot acknowledge internally, we project externally. The rage we won't claim becomes your anger problem. The weakness we can't accept becomes your oversensitivity. The shame we carry unconsciously becomes your obvious character flaws. Projection is the psyche's way of managing what it cannot integrate, and toxic families are projection factories. This brings us to the fourth spiritual reason. Empaths are born into toxic families. You are the mirror. You were placed in your family to reflect back to them the shadow material they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. You absorb their disowned emotions. You embody their rejected qualities. You become the living representation of everything they cannot bear to see when they look within. And they hate you for it, not because of who you actually are, but because of what you show them about themselves. Let me tell you about Rachel. Rachel's mother presented to the world as a pillar of strength. She was the church organizer, the community leader, the woman everyone turned to in crisis. She never complained. She never showed weakness. She never asked for help. Her persona was impermeability itself. Nothing got to her, nothing broke her, nothing made her vulnerable. But Rachel, from childhood, was anxious, constantly anxious. She worried about everything: school, friendships, her mother's approval, whether she'd locked the door, whether something terrible was about to happen. Her anxiety was so persistent, so pervasive, that therapists diagnosed her with generalized anxiety disorder. Medication was prescribed. Coping strategies were taught. But here's what no one recognized until Rachel was in her 30s. The anxiety wasn't hers. It was her mother's. Her mother, beneath the persona of strength, was terrified. Terrified of judgment, terrified of failure, terrified of appearing weak, terrified of losing control. But she couldn't acknowledge this terror because it contradicted her identity as the strong one, the capable one, the one who held it together for everyone else. So where did that unacknowledged terror go? Into Rachel. Rachel absorbed it. Rachel's nervous system became the expression of her mother's disowned anxiety, and her mother could maintain her persona of strength by pointing at Rachel and saying, "Why are you so anxious? What's wrong with you? I never struggle like this." This is shadow projection in its purest form. The mother disowned her anxiety, projected it onto her daughter, then judged her daughter for carrying it. And Rachel, being empathic, absorbed the projection so completely that she believed the anxiety was hers. She spent decades trying to fix herself, never realizing she was carrying her mother's unfelt feelings. Rachel's father operated similarly. He presented as emotionally controlled, logical, unaffected by feelings, but he was actually depressed, deeply, chronically depressed. He just couldn't acknowledge it because in his worldview, men didn't get depressed. Men were strong. Men pushed through. Feelings were weakness. So his depression went into Rachel. She became melancholic, withdrawn, struggled with suicidal ideation as a teenager, and her father would look at her with disgust and say, "Why are you so emotional? Why can't you just be strong? I never let things get to me like you do." He was looking at his own shadow reflected in his daughter, and he hated what he saw. This is the mirror function. The empath becomes the container for the family's collective shadow. All the emotions they won't feel, all the vulnerabilities they won't acknowledge, all the weaknesses they can't accept, it all goes into you. You become the symptom bearer. You become the identified patient. You become the embodiment of everything they've disowned in themselves. And from their perspective, This confirms that you're the problem. Look how anxious you are while we're fine. Look how depressed you are while we're stable. Look how sensitive you are while we're strong. You are clearly defective, clearly damaged, clearly the source of dysfunction in this otherwise healthy family. But the truth is exactly the opposite. You're the one carrying the family's illness so they can maintain the illusion of health. You're the one feeling what they won't feel so they can continue believing they don't feel it. You're the one expressing what they've repressed so they can keep their personas intact. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." He meant that what bothers us in others is usually something we haven't integrated in ourselves. The family's irritation with you, their judgment, their criticism, their attempts to fix you, is actually their discomfort with their own shadow material that you're reflecting back to them. But here's what makes this particularly insidious. Because you're empathic, because you have porous boundaries, because you absorb psychic material from your environment, you genuinely take on their disowned qualities. This isn't performative. This isn't you being manipulated into playing a role. This is your nervous system literally embodying what they're projecting. You absorb their anxiety, and it becomes your anxiety. You absorb their rage, and it becomes your rage. You absorb their shame, and it becomes your shame. Until you can't tell anymore where they end and you begin. Until you genuinely believe that these emotions, these qualities, these problems are yours and yours alone. This is crazy making in the most literal sense, because you're being treated as if you're generating emotions that are actually being pumped into you by people who won't own them. You're being pathologized for expressing what they're repressing. You're being judged for carrying what they've handed you, and the family needs you to keep carrying it. Because if you stop, if you suddenly establish boundaries, if you start returning their projections, if you say, "This anxiety isn't mine, it's yours," they're forced to face their own shadow. They're forced to acknowledge the very material they've spent their entire lives avoiding. Which is why when empaths start healing, when they start establishing boundaries, when they start differentiating their own emotions from projected ones, families often escalate. They increase the pressure. They amp up the criticism. They work harder to push the disowned material back into you because you were serving a function. And if you stop serving that function, the system destabilizes. The mirror role is sacred, but it's also unbearable. Because you're not just reflecting their shadow, you're absorbing it. You're metabolizing it. You're living with the weight of emotions and qualities that don't originate in you, but that you have no way to distinguish from your own genuine feelings. And the worst part? The family will never acknowledge this. They will never say, "We projected our anxiety onto you. We used you as an emotional dumping ground. We made you carry what we couldn't face." They will go to their graves believing you were the anxious one, the depressed one, the difficult one, and they were the healthy ones who tried so hard to help you. This is the mirror's grief. You carry their shadow and you receive no recognition for doing so. You're punished for the service you provide. You're rejected for fulfilling the function they assigned you. But here's what you need to understand about this role, and why it was a spiritual assignment rather than random victimization. By carrying the family shadow and making it visible through your own symptoms, you created the possibility, however rarely realized, for the family to become conscious of what they were denying. The family shadow doesn't disappear because it's disowned. It lives in the unconscious, driving behavior, creating symptoms, perpetuating dysfunction, but it remains invisible. The family can't heal what they can't see. They can't integrate what they won't acknowledge. They can't transform what they refuse to face. And you, by embodying it, made it visible. You took the invisible and gave it form. You took the abstract and made it concrete. You took what was hidden in the family's collective unconscious and brought it into the light of day through your own lived experience. Most families never use this gift. Most families never look at the mirror and think, oh, what I'm seeing in my child is actually reflecting something in me that I need to examine. Instead, they look at the mirror and think, my child is broken, my child needs to be fixed. But occasionally, not often, but occasionally, someone in the family becomes conscious enough to recognize the reflection. A sibling looks at your anxiety and realizes, wait, our whole family is anxious. We've just been pretending we're not. A parent late in life looks back and recognizes, I see now that I projected my own pain onto you. I made you carry what I couldn't face. These moments of recognition are rare, but when they happen, they're profound. Because the mirror has finally served its purpose. The shadow has been seen. The family has taken back its projection, and you are released from carrying what was never yours. But even if this never happens, even if your family never becomes conscious enough to recognize what you were reflecting, the spiritual function has still been fulfilled. Because you made the unconscious visible, you gave form to the formless. You brought the shadow into the light, even if no one else looked at it. And in doing so, you created a possibility that didn't exist before. You created an opening, a crack in the family's denial, a seed of consciousness that might not sprout for years or generations, but that exists now because you existed. Rachel, the woman I told you about, eventually had a breakthrough in therapy. Her therapist asked her to do an exercise. When you feel anxious, pause and ask yourself, whose anxiety is this? Is this mine, or am I absorbing someone else's? The first time Rachel did this, she was sitting in her car before a family dinner, chest tight, heart racing, mind spinning with worry. She paused and asked, whose anxiety is this? And immediately an image came to mind. Her mother. Her mother preparing the dinner, obsessing over every detail, terrified it wouldn't be perfect, catastrophizing about what people would think. Rachel realized, this isn't my anxiety. I was calm until I drove up to the house. The moment I got close, this hit me. I'm absorbing her anxiety like I always have. That recognition changed everything, because once Rachel could distinguish her mother's emotions from her own, she could choose whether to absorb them or not. She could establish a boundary. She could say internally, that's yours. I'm not carrying it anymore. The first time Rachel did this consciously, her anxiety dropped by half. Not because she'd done anything to fix her mother's anxiety, her mother was still anxious, but because Rachel was no longer absorbing it, no longer making it hers, no longer serving as the container for her mother's disowned feelings. This is what Jung called returning the projection. When you recognize that what you're carrying isn't yours, you can give it back. Not in a confrontational way. Most families will never be able to receive their projections consciously, but energetically, psychically. You simply stop absorbing. You stop being the mirror. You stop serving that function. And when you do this, something interesting happens. The family has to face what you were carrying for them. Your mother has to feel her own anxiety now that you're not absorbing it. Your father has to face his own depression now that you're not embodying it. They have to look at their own shadow now that you're not reflecting it for them. This usually makes them uncomfortable. They often respond by increasing pressure on you to go back to serving the mirror function. They escalate their projections. They ramp up their criticism. They try harder to push their disowned material back into you. But if you hold your boundary, if you consistently refuse to absorb what isn't yours, eventually something shifts. Either the family has to become more conscious, or they have to find a new mirror. Usually they choose the latter. They'll find another family member to carry the shadow, or they'll just increase their own symptoms, more anxiety, more depression, more dysfunction, because they're no longer exporting it into you. But none of that is your responsibility. Your responsibility was to serve as the mirror for as long as it took you to become conscious of that role. And now that you're conscious, your responsibility is to stop, to release the function, to return the projections, to reclaim your own psychic space. Jung wrote about this extensively in his work on the individuation process. He said that early in life, we often serve as containers for others' projections, parents, family, culture. We absorb their expectations, their unmet needs, their disowned qualities. And this is, in a way, developmentally appropriate. Children are supposed to absorb from their environment. That's how we learn. But at a certain point, and this point comes at different ages for different people, we have to differentiate. We have to separate what's ours from what's been projected onto us. We have to return the shadow material to its rightful owners. We have to stop serving as the mirror and start polishing our own authentic self. This differentiation is terrifying for the family because they lose their primary mechanism for shadow management. They lose the person who made them feel okay about themselves by carrying all the bad qualities. They lose the scapegoat whose dysfunction made them feel functional by comparison. And when they lose this, they often respond with rage, rejection, or increased pathologization. You've changed. You're not yourself anymore. You used to be so sweet, so accommodating, so easy. Now you're difficult, you're distant, you've become selfish. What they're really saying is, you used to serve our needs. You used to carry our shadow. You used to be the mirror that made us comfortable. Now you're refusing that role. Now we have to look at ourselves, and we don't like what we see. But this discomfort, as painful as it is for everyone involved, is actually the beginning of potential healing. Because discomfort is what motivates change. As long as the family was comfortable projecting their shadow onto you, they had no reason to do their own work. But now that you've stopped receiving their projections, they're forced to face their own material. Most won't do this work. Most will simply find new ways to avoid self-examination. But some, a few, will start to question, will start to wonder, will start to look inward instead of only outward. And for those who do, your refusal to continue serving as the mirror becomes the catalyst for their own growth. Your boundary becomes their opportunity. Your differentiation becomes their invitation to differentiate as well. But again, and I cannot stress this enough, this is not your responsibility. You did not take on the mirror role to fix your family. You took it on because your empathic nature made you vulnerable to absorbing their projections, and because at a soul level, you agreed to make their shadow visible, even if they never looked at it. That work is done now. The shadow has been reflected. The unconscious has been made visible. And whether they ever acknowledge it or not, you have served your function. Now your work is different. Now your work is reclamation, taking back the psychic space they occupied, returning their emotions, their qualities, their shadow material to them, establishing boundaries where there were none, learning to distinguish your authentic self from the projection screen you became. This is the sacred work of healing for the mirror. This isn't mine becomes your mantra. Every time anxiety rises, you ask, is this mine or am I absorbing someone else's? Every time rage surfaces, you ask, is this my rage or am I carrying someone else's? Every time shame floods you, you ask, is this my shame or am I holding someone else's? And gradually, not overnight, but gradually, you learn to feel the difference. You learn to recognize your own emotional signature versus the emotions you're absorbing from others. You develop what's called psychic discernment, the ability to distinguish self from other, your energy from their energy, your emotions from their projections. This is advanced empathic work. This is mastery-level consciousness. And it's the work you're being called to now, having served your time as the unconscious mirror. Rachel practiced this discernment for months, and slowly her chronic anxiety began to lift. Not completely. She had some genuine anxiety of her own to process, But the overwhelming, constant anxiety that had defined her entire life, that was her mother's. And once Rachel stopped absorbing it, it no longer controlled her. Her mother's anxiety, interestingly, got worse. Her mother started having panic attacks for the first time in her life. She started needing medication, needing therapy, needing support. And Rachel's siblings were confused. Mom was always so strong. What happened? She's falling apart. But Rachel understood. Mom wasn't falling apart. Mom was finally feeling what she'd been projecting into Rachel for 40 years. Mom was finally facing her own shadow, and while it was painful to watch, it was also necessary. It was honest. It was real. Rachel's relationship with her mother became more distant, but also more authentic, because Rachel was no longer performing the function of absorbing her mother's disowned anxiety. They had to relate as two separate people rather than as projector and projection screen. It was uncomfortable for both of them, but it was also the first honest relationship they'd ever had. This is what releasing the mirror function looks like. Increased distance, increased authenticity, increased discomfort for everyone involved, but also increased consciousness, increased reality, increased possibility for genuine relationship rather than functional enmeshment. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But he also knew that before genuine meeting can happen, there must be two separate substances. There must be differentiation. You cannot truly meet someone if you're merged with them, if you're carrying their projections, if you're serving as their mirror. So the paradox is this: you must become less available to your family in order to become more genuine with them. You must withdraw from the mirror function in order to eventually, maybe, have authentic relationship. You must stop reflecting their shadow in order to stand as your own person. And some families never forgive this. Some families prefer the enmeshed, functional, shadow-carrying relationship to the differentiated, authentic, but more distant one. Some families would rather have the mirror than have you. And if that's true in your family, that's information, painful information, but crucial information. It tells you that they need the function more than they want the person, that they require the projection screen more than they value the autonomous individual. And if you discover this, if you realize that your family cannot tolerate your differentiation, then you have a choice to make. Do you go back to serving the mirror function to maintain relationship? Or do you maintain your boundaries and accept whatever distance results? There's no universally right answer to this question. It's deeply personal. It depends on how much the relationship matters to you, how much it costs you to continue serving the function, what you're willing to sacrifice for belonging. But what I can tell you is this: the mirror function was always meant to be temporary. It was a developmental stage, not a permanent identity. You served it in childhood because you had no choice. But you're not in childhood anymore, and you do have choice now. The question is, will you claim it? Jung's entire individuation process is about this claiming. It's about taking back the psychic space you gave away, or that was taken from you. It's about differentiating from collective projections and standing as an autonomous individual. It's about polishing your own authentic self rather than serving as the reflection of others. This is terrifying work, because it means risking everything: family approval, belonging, love, acceptance, for the sake of something less tangible: personal authenticity, psychological integrity, genuine self-knowledge. But Jung would say this is the only work worth doing, because a life lived as someone else's projection screen is not your life, it's theirs. And you will reach the end having never actually inhabited your own existence. The mirror role was sacred. It served a purpose. It made the invisible visible. But it's complete now. You've reflected what needed to be reflected. You've made conscious what needed consciousness. You've shown them what they wouldn't look at in themselves, and whether they ever thank you for it or not, whether they ever recognize what you did or not, you are released from that function now. It's time to stop being the mirror. It's time to start being yourself. The question is, do you know who that is? Because after years, maybe decades, of reflecting others' shadow, of carrying their projections, of embodying their disowned qualities, do you remember what's actually yours? Do you know your own emotional signature? Can you recognize your authentic self beneath all the layers of what you absorbed from them? This is the work ahead, excavation, returning projection after projection until you find yourself beneath them, releasing emotion after emotion until you discover which feelings are genuinely yours, shedding identity after identity until you uncover who you actually are when you're not serving as someone else's psychic container. It's archaeological work, it's spiritual work, it's the deepest individuation work Jung ever described. And it's the work you're being called to now, having completed your time as the family mirror. So let them see their own reflection for once. Let them face their own shadow. Let them carry their own anxiety, depression, rage, and shame. It was always theirs anyway. You were just holding it for them, and now it's time to give it back. There is a type of empathic child who does something that most people cannot comprehend until they've either done it themselves or witnessed it directly. They consciously draw fire. They deliberately provoke the abusive parent's rage toward themselves to protect younger or more vulnerable siblings. They volunteer to be the target, the scapegoat, the one who absorbs the toxicity, because if they don't, someone more fragile will. This is the lightning rod, and this is the fifth most painful spiritual reason some empaths are born into toxic families. You were the sacrifice. You absorbed the family's toxicity so that others, usually siblings, sometimes a parent, could survive relatively intact. This is not metaphorical. This is literal. You took the hit, repeatedly, deliberately, because you understood at some level that someone had to, and you were strong enough to survive it when they were not. Let me tell you about Marcus. Marcus was the oldest of 3 children. His father was violent, not constantly, not predictably, but explosively. Something would trigger him, a perceived slight, a bad day at work, the wrong tone in someone's voice, and the rage would come. He would yell, intimidate, throw things, grab, push, hit, not every day, but often enough that the entire house lived in constant tension, waiting for the next eruption. Marcus's younger sister Emma was fragile. She was small, anxious, sensitive in ways that even Marcus, who was empathic himself, recognized as more extreme. When their father raged, Emma would freeze, dissociate, become a ghost. Marcus watched her disappear inside herself during these episodes, and he knew she wouldn't survive this, not psychologically, not if it continued happening to her. So Marcus started a pattern. When he sensed their father's anger building, and as an empath, Marcus could feel it before it erupted, he would do something to redirect it toward himself. He would talk back. He would challenge his father's authority. He would say the thing that would make him the target instead of Emma. At 12 years old, Marcus was consciously managing his father's rage, drawing it toward himself, absorbing it, taking the psychological and physical blows so that his little sister wouldn't have to. His youngest brother Noah was different from Emma, tougher, more resilient, better at emotional detachment. But Marcus protected him too, because even resilient children can only take so much. Even tough kids break eventually, and Marcus had decided, though he couldn't have articulated it at the time, that he would be the one to break instead. This is the sacrifice function, and if you've served this role, you know what I'm talking about. You know what it means to make yourself the target. You know what it means to carry the impact so that others don't have to. You know what it means to consciously choose suffering to protect someone more vulnerable. And this is extraordinarily advanced spiritual work that most people will never comprehend, because most people's instinct in an abusive environment is self-preservation. Protect yourself, make yourself small, fly under the radar, do whatever you can to avoid being the target. But lightning rods do the opposite. They make themselves bigger. They step into the line of fire. They draw the toxicity toward themselves because someone has to absorb it, and they've decided it should be them. Jung wrote about what he called the designated carrier, the concept that family systems unconsciously select one member to carry the pathology so that the system can maintain equilibrium. Usually, this designation is unconscious. The person becomes the carrier without choosing it, without understanding it, simply by being the most sensitive or the most available psychically. But sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the carrier volunteers. Consciously, they see what's happening, they recognize the danger, and they make a choice. Better me than them. Marcus made that choice at 12, and he continued making it through his teenage years. Every time his father's rage was building, Marcus would provoke it. Every time tension was escalating toward his siblings, Marcus would intervene and redirect it. He became so skilled at this that Emma and Noah rarely experienced their father's direct violence after Marcus turned 13, but Marcus absorbed all of it, and it destroyed parts of him. By the time Marcus was 25, he was suicidal. He had complex PTSD. He struggled with rage of his own, his father's rage, now internalized, now turned against himself. He couldn't maintain relationships. He couldn't hold a job. He was barely functional. Meanwhile, Emma went to college, got married, had a successful career. Noah became a teacher, started a family, seemed well-adjusted. They both had their struggles. You can't grow up in that house completely unscathed, but they were functional. They had lives. They had futures. Marcus had carried the cost so they could have those things. And here's what makes this role almost too painful to bear. No one acknowledged what Marcus did. Emma didn't remember most of the early incidents. She'd dissociated through them, which was the entire point of Marcus's intervention. Noah was too young to understand the pattern, and their mother, who witnessed all of it, had told herself that Marcus was difficult, that he provoked his father, that he was the problem child. The sacrifice was invisible. The protection went unrecognized. The deliberate absorption of violence was interpreted as Marcus being inherently troubled, rather than Marcus being the strongest person in the family who took on the impossible burden of managing a violent parent's rage. This is the unique torture of the sacrifice role. You give everything, and you receive not gratitude, but blame. You protect others at enormous cost to yourself, and you're labeled the problem. You volunteer for the hardest spiritual assignment a child can take on, and you're treated as if you're defective. Jung understood this. He wrote about the scapegoat archetype, the figure who carries the sins of the collective, who absorbs the community's shadow, who is exiled or sacrificed so that others can remain clean. In biblical tradition, the scapegoat literally had the sins of the community placed upon it, then was driven into the wilderness to die. The community was purified. The scapegoat was destroyed. You were the scapegoat, not metaphorically, literally. Your family's toxicity was placed upon you, some of it unconsciously, some of it through your own deliberate absorption, and you carried it so they didn't have to. And this raises the most difficult question in this entire video. Was it worth it? Marcus struggled with this question for years in therapy. He would say, I saved Emma, I saved Noah. They have good lives because I took what would have destroyed them. But I'm destroyed. I'm the one who can't function. I'm the one who's suicidal. So was it worth it? Did I make the right choice? Should I have protected myself instead? And his therapist's response was profound. You didn't make a choice in the usual sense, Marcus. You responded to an impossible situation in the only way your nature allowed. As an empathic child who could feel your siblings' vulnerability, who could sense that they wouldn't survive what you could survive, you did what empaths do. You absorbed the toxicity to protect others. This wasn't a calculated decision. This was your spiritual nature expressing itself in an extreme environment. This is what I need you to understand if you served the sacrifice role. You didn't fail at self-preservation. You succeeded at protection. Your instinct wasn't self-protection, it was other protection. And in an abusive family, that instinct made you the lightning rod for all the family's violence, dysfunction, and toxicity. This is not weakness, this is extraordinary strength, because it takes more courage to step into fire than to hide from it. It takes more spiritual advancement to sacrifice yourself for others than to prioritize your own survival. It takes the kind of soul power that most people will never access. But, and this is crucial, just because you were strong enough to carry it doesn't mean you should have had to. Just because you protected your siblings doesn't mean the sacrifice was fair. Just because you volunteered at a soul level doesn't mean your child self wasn't genuinely harmed. Both realities are true. You performed an act of profound spiritual service, and you were damaged by it. You saved your siblings, and you deserved protection yourself. You were the strongest, and you shouldn't have had to be. This is the razor's edge again. This is the paradox that spiritual bypassing tries to collapse, but that we must hold in tension. Your sacrifice had meaning. Your sacrifice had purpose. Your sacrifice had spiritual nobility, and it was still a tragedy that you had to make it at all. Jung wrote, "A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them." He understood that some souls descend into darkness as part of their development, but he also understood that the descent is real suffering, not just a metaphor or a lesson. The inferno burns, the sacrifice costs, the absorption of toxicity destroys parts of you, and you have every right to rage at the unfairness of it. You have every right to grieve what you lost. You have every right to be angry that you had to be so strong so young, that you had to manage adult cruelty as a child, that you had to sacrifice your own well-being for your siblings' survival. This rage is not ungrateful. This grief is not weakness. This anger is not spiritual failure. It's the appropriate response to an unbearable burden that should never have been placed on a child, even a child whose soul volunteered for it. Marcus eventually reached a place of complex acceptance, not gratitude for the suffering, not everything happens for a reason, spiritual, bypassing, but a recognition of multiple truths held simultaneously. I hate what happened to me. I grieve what I lost. I'm furious that I had to do what I did, and I'm proud that I protected Emma and Noah, and I understand now that my empathic nature made this inevitable. I couldn't have done otherwise, and I'm working now to heal what was broken in me, and I no longer carry the illusion that my sacrifice makes me less worthy of care, healing, and love. This is mature spiritual understanding. This is Jung's individuation taken to its highest level, the ability to hold contradictions, to honor complexity, to refuse simplistic narratives while still extracting meaning from suffering. If you served the sacrifice role, here's what I need you to know. Your sacrifice was real. Your protection of others was genuine. The impact you absorbed for them was substantial, and you are not required to remain in that role forever. The assignment was for childhood, not for your entire life. Many people who serve as lightning rods in childhood continue the pattern into adulthood. They become the friend everyone dumps on. They become the partner who absorbs their loved one's anger. They become the coworker who takes responsibility for others' mistakes. They become the family member who still, decades later, manages everyone's emotions, smooths over every conflict, absorbs every bit of toxicity so that everyone else can remain comfortable. This is the continued sacrifice, and it's no longer necessary. You completed your assignment. You protected your siblings through childhood. You absorbed what needed to be absorbed during the most vulnerable years. But you don't owe anyone continued self-destruction. You don't have to keep taking the hit. You don't have to remain the lightning rod forever. Marcus reached this realization at 28. He started establishing boundaries with his siblings, not cutting them off, but stopping his pattern of absorbing their problems, managing their emotions, sacrificing his own needs for theirs. And they were confused, hurt even, because they'd become accustomed to Marcus being the one who absorbed, the one who sacrificed, the one who gave endlessly. Emma said to him, "You've changed. You used to be so caring, now you're selfish." She genuinely believed this, because in her mind, caring meant Marcus sacrificing himself for her. Selfishness meant Marcus taking care of himself. But Marcus held his boundary. He said, "I protected you when we were kids because you needed protection, and I was strong enough to take what you couldn't. But we're adults now. I'm not responsible for managing your emotions anymore. I'm not responsible for absorbing your problems. I love you, but I'm done sacrificing myself." This was devastating for Emma to hear, and it was terrifying for Marcus to say, because the sacrifice role becomes identity. It becomes how you relate to others. It becomes what makes you valuable, what makes you lovable, what gives you purpose. And when you release it, you have to face the question, who am I if I'm not the one sacrificing for others? What's my value if I'm not absorbing toxicity? Will anyone love me if I'm not constantly giving myself away? These are existential questions, questions of identity and worth, questions that can only be answered through the painful process of discovering that you have value beyond your function, that you are lovable beyond your usefulness, that you matter even when you're not sacrificing. Jung called this withdrawing projections and reclaiming the self. When you've been the sacrifice, everyone projects onto you the role of absorber, protector, caretaker. And when you withdraw from that role, they feel abandoned, because in a way they are being abandoned. They're being forced to carry their own weight, feel their own emotions, handle their own problems, things you've been doing for them. But this is their growth edge, not your responsibility. Your responsibility now is to heal from the years of sacrifice, to tend to the parts of yourself that were damaged while you were busy protecting others, to give yourself the care you gave them, to become the lightning rod that attracts healing rather than the lightning rod that absorbs toxicity. This is the sacred work of the post-sacrifice life, learning to receive, learning to rest, learning to let others carry their own weight, learning that you don't have to earn love through suffering, learning that protection goes both ways. You're allowed to be protected too. Marcus is still learning this. Years into his healing journey, he still has the instinct to step into the line of fire. He still has the impulse to absorb others' pain. He still has the identity of protector, sacrifice, lightning rod. But now he has consciousness around it. Now he has choice. Now he can notice the impulse and decide whether acting on it serves his healing or continues his pattern. That's all we're aiming for, not the elimination of empathic protective instincts, but the consciousness to choose when and how to express them. Not the death of the sacrifice, but its transformation from unconscious compulsion to conscious choice. You were the sacrifice because you were strong enough, because you were empathic enough, because your soul was advanced enough to take on that unbearable burden. But strength doesn't mean you're required to keep sacrificing. Empathy doesn't mean you owe others your destruction. Soul advancement doesn't mean endless self-abnegation. It means you had the capacity to carry an impossible weight when you were young. And now, as an adult, you have the responsibility to put that weight down. Your siblings survived because of you. Honor that. Your family maintained equilibrium because you absorbed the chaos. Acknowledge that. You performed an act of love so profound that most people will never comprehend it. Claim that, and then release it, because the assignment is complete. The protection is done. The sacrifice has been made, and you are allowed, no, you are required, to choose yourself now, to protect yourself now, to stop being the lightning rod that absorbs others' storms and become the tree that weathers its own. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, but you can't become who you truly are while you're still sacrificing yourself for everyone else. You can't discover your authentic self while you're busy being the shock absorber for your family's dysfunction. So the question isn't whether your sacrifice had meaning. It did. The question is, what will you do now that the sacrifice is no longer required? Who will you become when you're no longer defined by what you absorb for others? How will you relate to your family and to the world when you're no longer the lightning rod? These are the questions that will lead you home to yourself. These are the questions that will complete your journey from sacrifice to self. These are the questions that honor what you gave while claiming what you deserve. A life that's yours, not a reflection of others' needs, not a function in a dysfunctional system, but your own precious, irreplaceable life. You took the hit so they could live. Now it's your turn to live too. There's a question that empaths raised in toxic families eventually ask, why am I like this? Why am I so sensitive, so attuned, so overwhelmed by others' emotions? Was I born this way, or did my environment make me this way? And the answer, as with most nature versus nurture questions, is both. But there's a spiritual and evolutionary dimension to this that most discussions miss. This brings us to the sixth spiritual reason. You developed heightened empathic sensitivity as a survival adaptation in a dangerous environment. You became what I call a sensitive receptor. Your nervous system evolved empathic attunement as an early warning system for threat, and what began as survival mechanism eventually became spiritual capacity. Let me explain the mechanism, because understanding this will completely reframe how you see your sensitivity. When a child grows up in an unpredictable, volatile, or dangerous environment where a parent's mood can shift from calm to violent in moments, where you never know which version of your parent will come home, where the emotional or physical safety of the household can collapse without warning, that child's nervous system adapts. It has to. Survival demands it. And one of the most powerful adaptations the nervous system can make is hypervigilance, constant environmental scanning for signs of danger. But this isn't just conscious awareness. This is the unconscious activation of systems that read micro-expressions, vocal tones, body language, emotional shifts, energy patterns. The child becomes exquisitely attuned to the subtlest indicators of threat. This is the neurological basis of empathy. Mirror neurons that fire when observing others, emotions, interoceptive awareness that registers others' internal states in your own body, right hemisphere processing that reads emotional subtext faster than conscious thought. In most people, these systems operate at baseline, but in children raised in threatening environments, these systems go into overdrive. You learn to read your parent's face for micro-expressions that indicated impending rage. You learn to sense the tension in your parent's body before they moved. You learn to detect the shift in your parent's energy when they walked through the door. Could you relax, or did you need to hide? You learn to hear the meaning beneath their words, the threat in their tone, the danger in their silence. This wasn't a choice. This was survival. Your nervous system was doing what nervous systems do in threat environments, adapting to increase your odds of safety. Let me tell you about Elena. Elena's mother was bipolar, unmedicated, unpredictable. Some days she was loving, attentive, present. Other days she was rageful, critical, violent, and Elena never knew which mother she would get. There were no external indicators. Her mother's shifts could happen in seconds. So Elena became a reader of the invisible. By age 6, she could look at her mother's eyes and know, before her mother said a word, before her mother moved, what kind of day it would be. She could sense the biochemical shift in her mother's energy. She could feel the pressure building before the storm hit. Elena's siblings didn't have this capacity. They would be caught off guard by their mother's sudden rages. They would approach her happily, not sensing the danger, and get verbally eviscerated. They would relax when she seemed calm, not realizing the calm was temporary. But Elena knew. Elena always knew, and this knowing allowed her to protect herself, to stay small when necessary, to avoid triggering her mother, to read the signs and adjust her behavior to maximize safety. This is what I mean by empathy as survival adaptation. Elena wasn't born with extraordinary empathic sensitivity, though she may have had a predisposition toward it. But her environment demanded that her sensitivity develop to extraordinary levels, or she wouldn't survive. So her nervous system delivered. And here's what neuroscience is now discovering. These adaptations don't just stay active during childhood, they become hardwired. The neural pathways that developed to detect danger become permanent features of your nervous system. The mirror neurons that went into overdrive to read your parent's emotional state remain hyperactive. The interoceptive awareness that registered your parent's internal shifts continues registering everyone's internal shifts. Even when you're no longer in danger, even when the threat is gone. Even when you're an adult in safe environments, your nervous system is still operating as if you're a child in a threatening household, constantly scanning, constantly reading, constantly absorbing emotional data from everyone around you. This is why so many empaths raised in toxic families describe feeling overwhelmed by others' emotions. Your nervous system is processing emotional data at industrial speeds, because that's what it was trained to do. It's giving you information about others' internal states that most people never consciously register, because your survival once depended on having that information. But now, in safe environments with safe people, this adaptation becomes a burden, because you're receiving constant emotional input that you don't need for survival, but that your nervous system can't stop processing. It's like having a smoke alarm that's so sensitive it goes off when you toast bread. Let me describe a life you might recognize. You're 4 years old, and you walk into the kitchen where your mother is standing at the sink. She hasn't said a word. Her face looks normal, but something in your chest tightens immediately. A wave of sadness that doesn't belong to you crashes through your small body. You don't have words for it yet, but you know. She's drowning in something, and somehow, you're drowning too. You walk over and hug her leg. She smiles weakly and says, "You're such a sweet child. You've just performed your first act of emotional labor, and you're barely old enough to tie your shoes." Fast forward. You're 14, and your parents haven't spoken to each other in 3 days. The silence in the house is so thick it's hard to breathe. Everyone's pretending everything is fine. But you feel the rage, the resentment, the decade of unspoken disappointments pressing against the walls. At dinner, you crack a joke. Everyone laughs just for a moment. The tension breaks. You've just discovered your purpose. Be the pressure release valve. Keep everyone from exploding. Make it bearable. You don't consciously think this. It just becomes who you are. The family emotional regulator. The shock absorber for everyone else's unprocessed feelings. By 25, you're in your third therapist's office, and they're using words like codependent and enmeshed and poor boundaries. They're suggesting you have an anxiety disorder, maybe depression, definitely some kind of attachment trauma. They ask why you're always exhausted, why you can't say no, why every relationship you enter becomes you playing therapist to someone else's chaos. And you sit there thinking the same thing you've thought your entire life. Something is deeply wrong with me. I'm too sensitive. I feel too much. I'm broken in some fundamental way that other people aren't. This is the lie, the cultural conditioning that's been programmed into empaths since childhood. We live in a world that treats sensitivity like a disorder requiring medication, that sees emotional awareness as weakness, that tells us feeling other people's pain means there's something malfunctioning in our nervous system. The message is clear. Normal people have thicker skin. Normal people don't cry at commercials. Normal people can watch someone suffering and not feel it in their own body like a second heartbeat. And here's what makes it worse. Your toxic family needed you to believe this lie. They needed you to think you were the problem, because as long as you believed you were too sensitive, you'd never notice that they were too unconscious. As long as you believed something was wrong with you, you'd never see that you were actually the most awake person in a house full of sleepwalkers. Jung had a term for this, the identified patient. In dysfunctional family systems, one person unconsciously volunteers, or is volunteered, to carry the sickness of the entire system. That person becomes the scapegoat, the problem child, the one who's always having breakdowns or struggling or too much to handle. But Jung saw deeper. He understood that the identified patient isn't sick. They're sensitive. They're the only one in the family whose nervous system is awake enough to feel the collective shadow that everyone else is numbing themselves against. The empath child doesn't create the family dysfunction. They simply refuse to pretend it doesn't exist. And for that crime, the crime of feeling what's real, they're labeled as the broken one. So you spend years, maybe decades, trying to fix yourself. Therapy, self-help books, meditation apps, boundary-setting workshops, all of it aimed at one goal: become less sensitive, feel less, care less, absorb less, build thicker walls. And maybe some of that helps. Maybe you learn some useful skills, but deep down there's still that whisper. What if there's nothing to fix? What if this thing I've been trying to cure is actually what I came here to develop? That whisper is your soul trying to tell you the truth Jung spent his lifetime attempting to articulate. You're not a mistake. You're not damaged. You're not too much. You're an empath who was spiritually assigned to a toxic family for reasons so profound that psychology barely has language for them yet. And everything you thought was your weakness, that's about to become your initiation into power you didn't know existed. Jung didn't just study psychology, he studied alchemy, not the literal medieval quest to turn lead into gold, but what he called psychological alchemy, the ancient symbolic language for how consciousness transforms suffering into wisdom. And in the alchemical texts, he found something that perfectly described what happens to empaths in toxic families. The alchemists called it the crucible, a sealed vessel where base materials are subjected to intense heat and pressure until they undergo complete transformation. Nothing escapes the crucible. The heat can't be avoided. And the transformation only happens because of the intensity, not despite it. Your toxic family was your crucible, not metaphorically, literally. In Jungian terms, they created what he called the temenos, a sacred, sealed container where transformation must occur. Think about it. You couldn't leave as a child. You were trapped in that emotional intensity with no escape route. Every dinner was a potential explosion. Every silence was loaded with unspoken rage or grief or terror. Every interaction required you to scan the emotional field, assess the danger level, calibrate your response. Your nervous system was being forged in fire every single day. And here's what Jung understood that most people miss. Consciousness doesn't develop in comfort. It doesn't grow in peaceful, functional, emotionally regulated environments. Those environments are wonderful for maintaining consciousness once you have it, but they don't create it. Consciousness is born from friction, from paradox, from being forced to hold opposing realities simultaneously. It emerges when the psyche is put under such pressure that it must either fragment or integrate at a higher level. This is why empaths are born into toxic families. Your soul required a specific intensity of emotional chaos to develop the gift you came here to carry. You needed to be in an environment where emotions were so extreme, so volatile, so denied and projected and acted out that you had no choice but to develop extraordinary perceptual sensitivity just to survive. Every child in a dysfunctional family learns survival skills, but empaths learn something more. They learn to sense the invisible, to feel the unspoken, to navigate by emotional sonar in complete psychological darkness. Jung wrote about the alchemical process of nigredo, the blackening, the descent into the darkest material. It's the first and necessary stage of transformation. You had to descend into your family's shadow material, their rage, their shame, their intergenerational trauma, their unprocessed grief, and somehow not be destroyed by it. You had to metabolize psychological poison, and the fact that you survived it means your psyche has capacities that most people never develop. You became what the alchemists called the philosopher's stone, the agent that can transform lead into gold, poison into medicine, unconsciousness into awareness. But let's get specific about what this means. Your mother's narcissism, that wasn't just about her. She was carrying her mother's unresolved wound, who was carrying her mother's generation after generation of women who were taught to suppress their needs until they became bottomless voids, demanding endless supply. And you, with your sensitivity, could feel that ancestral pain, not just hers, but the echo of all the women in your lineage who were never allowed to be fully human. You became the vessel for intergenerational trauma that no one else in the family was conscious enough to carry. Or your father's rage, that volcanic fury that would erupt over nothing, that kept everyone walking on eggshells. Jung would tell you that rage wasn't his. He inherited it from his father, who inherited it from his father. Generations of men whose anger was the only emotion they were permitted to feel because everything else, grief, fear, vulnerability, had to be buried. And you, the empath child, became the one who had to witness it, absorb it, and somehow not let it destroy you. This is what Jung meant by the collective unconscious. We're not just carrying our own psychological material. We're carrying the unresolved wounds of our entire lineage. And families keep unconsciously reproducing the same patterns, the same traumas, the same toxic dynamics, until someone conscious enough is born into the system. Someone whose nervous system is sensitive enough to feel what's really happening. Someone who can't numb themselves with the usual methods. Alcohol, work, denial, projection. Someone like you. Jung said it clearly. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. You were the reaction agent in a family system that had been emotionally stagnant, sometimes for generations. Your sensitivity created the reaction. Your awareness disturbed the unconscious equilibrium. And yes, it was excruciating. Yes, you paid a terrible price. But the transformation that's possible now, for you and through you, for your entire lineage, that could only happen because you were forged in that specific crucible. Maya's story, the daughter who absorbed everything. Let me tell you about Maya. She'll never forget the first time she realized something was different about her. She was 7 years old, playing in her room, when she suddenly felt this crushing weight in her chest, like something was pressing down on her lungs, making it hard to breathe. She walked into the living room and found her mother sitting on the couch, staring at nothing, silent tears running down her face. Maya didn't ask what was wrong. She just knew. She climbed onto the couch, put her small arms around her mother, and said, "It's okay, Mommy. I'm here." Her mother smiled through her tears and said, "You're such a good girl, so sensitive. You always know when Mommy needs you." And in that moment, without realizing it, Maya learned her purpose. Exist to sense and soothe her mother's pain. Be the emotional support animal in a house where feelings were everywhere but never directly acknowledged. From that day forward, Maya could feel her mother's mood before she walked in the door from school. If her mother was in one of her dark periods, the weeks where she wouldn't get dressed, where she'd snap at everyone, where the house felt like it was filled with invisible poison gas, Maya would become invisible. She'd move through the house like a ghost, making herself small, erasing her needs, becoming whatever shape would cause the least disruption. When her mother was in her manic phases, suddenly redecorating, cooking elaborate meals, talking rapidly about new projects, Maya would become her mother's audience, her cheerleader, the one person who never questioned or deflated the temporary euphoria. And underneath both extremes, Maya carried a question she couldn't articulate. Whose feelings are these? Which emotions are mine? By 14, Maya had become the family's unofficial therapist. Her parents had been locked in a Cold War for years, not divorcing, not really together, just two people sharing space and resentment. They didn't fight. That would have been too honest. Instead, they communicated through her. Her father would complain to Maya about her mother's spending. Her mother would cry to Maya about her father's emotional unavailability, and Maya, desperate to hold her family together, would try to translate between them, to fix what she couldn't even name. She excelled at school, perfect grades, never any trouble, the kind of kid teachers loved because she was so responsible and mature for her age. But inside, she was collapsing. She had constant stomach aches, migraines that would knock her out for days. She'd lie in her dark bedroom, feeling like her body was rejecting something it couldn't digest. She didn't know then that she was metabolizing her family's emotional toxins, that her physical illness was her body's way of trying to expel what didn't belong to her. By 25, Maya had done everything right. Good career, nice apartment, friends who loved her. But every relationship she entered followed the same pattern. She'd meet someone with problems, addiction, depression, unresolved trauma, and feel this overwhelming pull to help them. She'd pour everything into fixing them, managing their emotions, being their source of stability. And when they inevitably left or betrayed her or simply drained her dry, she'd feel gutted. Not just sad, fundamentally depleted, like her life force had been siphoned away. Her therapist was the seventh one she'd tried. The others had been kind but ineffective, giving her worksheets on boundaries and self-care that felt hollow. But this therapist was different. In their third session, after Maya had described her latest relationship disaster, the therapist said something that cracked her open. "Maya, what if you're not codependent? What if you're a healer who hasn't learned she doesn't have to take the poison into her own body to cure someone else?" Then the therapist introduced her to Jung's concept of the wounded healer, the archetype of one who has descended into their own underworld, who has faced their own shadow and survived, and who can now guide others through darkness because they know the terrain intimately. The therapist asked, "What if your childhood wasn't about you being weak or broken? What if it was shamanic training? What if you were learning to navigate emotional realms that most people don't even know exist?" Something shifted in Maya in that moment, a reframe so total it felt like her entire past was being rewritten. She wasn't damaged, she was initiated. Her hypersensitivity wasn't a disorder, requiring medication. It was psychic perception being forged. Her inability to ignore pain wasn't dysfunction. It was the development of a healer's consciousness. All those years of absorbing her family's emotional chaos weren't wasted suffering. They were her apprenticeship. She began studying Jung obsessively. She learned about the collective unconscious, about how we carry not just our own wounds, but the unresolved trauma of our entire lineage. She understood, finally, that her mother's bottomless need wasn't personal. It was generational, a wound passed down through women who were never allowed to have needs of their own. Her father's emotional paralysis wasn't about her. It was inherited from generations of men who equated vulnerability with weakness, and she realized the most liberating truth of all. She hadn't been born broken into this family. She had been born whole, and her wholeness was what the family needed. She was the one conscious enough to feel what everyone else was numbing, aware enough to see what everyone else was denying, strong enough to carry what would have destroyed them if they'd had to face it directly. "I wasn't born broken into this family," she told her therapist months later, tears streaming down her face, but something like joy in her voice. "I was born whole, and the family's brokenness became my spiritual curriculum. Every moment I thought was destroying me was actually forging me. I'm not a victim of my sensitivity. I'm an initiate who survived the training." Let's go deeper. Let's map out exactly why this happens, why empaths are born into families that seem designed to break them. Jung's psychology, combined with spiritual wisdom traditions, reveals 6 specific reasons. These aren't meant to justify the abuse or minimize the damage. They're meant to help you understand the sacred architecture beneath your pain. Reason 1: shadow integration training. Most people go their entire lives without ever truly confronting humanity's shadow. The rage, the cruelty, the manipulation, the violence that lives in every psyche but gets projected outward onto bad people or evil others. Empaths in toxic families don't have that luxury. From childhood, you were face to face with the human shadow in its rawest forms. Maybe it was your father's rage that could explode without warning. Maybe it was your mother's manipulation, the way she could twist reality until you doubted your own perceptions. Maybe it was addiction, violence, neglect, the 1,000 ways unconsciousness manifests when it's denied. This wasn't cruelty, though it felt like it. This was accelerated shadow work. By the time most people are introduced to the concept of the shadow, in their first therapy session at 40, you've already spent decades navigating shadow territory. You know what denial looks like from the inside. You know how people rationalize their worst behaviors. You know the difference between someone who's genuinely working on themselves and someone who's performing change while staying fundamentally unconscious. This makes you, later in life, a master shadow worker. You can spot projection instantly. You can feel when someone's blaming you for feelings they refuse to own. You can sense the difference between authentic vulnerability and victimhood used as manipulation. These are skills that take most people decades of intensive therapy to develop. You got forced march training in childhood. Reason 2: boundary alchemy. Jung talked about ego boundaries, the psychological membrane that separates your inner world from the outer world, that helps you distinguish between your feelings and others' feelings, between what's your responsibility and what belongs to other people. Most people are born with moderately permeable ego boundaries. Empaths are born with what Jung called thin boundaries, or permeable psychic structure. Your internal world and the external world aren't clearly separated. You feel what others feel as if it's happening in your own body. In a healthy family, this gift would be gently nurtured, taught how to sense others' emotions while maintaining your own center, how to be compassionate without collapsing into others' experience. But you weren't born into a healthy family. You were born into a family with such extreme boundary violations, emotional incest, parentification, enmeshment, scapegoating, that you either completely dissolved under the onslaught or you developed the most sophisticated boundary system known to psychology. Toxic families forced you to learn boundary alchemy, how to be deeply sensitive while also being fiercely protected, how to feel someone's pain without absorbing it, how to care without carrying, how to be present without becoming porous. Most empaths don't learn this until their 30s or 40s after they've been destroyed enough times to finally figure out the technology of energetic boundaries. But those who do, they become masters of what Jung called the art of relationship, the ability to be deeply connected while remaining profoundly yourself. Reason 3. The collective scapegoat mission. In his later work, Jung explored archetypal psychology, the idea that certain roles and patterns repeat across all human cultures and throughout history. One of the most powerful and most painful is the scapegoat archetype, the one who carries the group's unconscious sin, who bears the blame for collective shadow material, who gets expelled or punished so the group can maintain its illusion of innocence. This happens in families too. Toxic families need a scapegoat, someone to blame for all the dysfunction no one wants to acknowledge. And empaths, with their sensitivity and their inability to pretend things are fine, inevitably become that person. You're the too sensitive one, the difficult one, the one who makes everything awkward by naming unspoken tensions. You become the identified patient, the problem child, the reason the family is struggling, even though the real issues were there long before you were born. But here's what Jung understood that most psychology misses. The scapegoat isn't a victim. The scapegoat is a sacred role, a spiritual assignment. You incarnated into this family specifically to carry the collective shadow consciously, to feel what everyone else is denying, to metabolize toxins that would poison the entire system if they stayed unconscious. This doesn't mean the abuse was okay. It means the abuse had a meaning that transcends personal victimhood. You were the one strong enough to carry it, the one conscious enough to eventually transform it. And when you do, when you heal yourself and reclaim your life, you don't just free yourself. You free your entire lineage. Jung believed that psychological healing works backward and forward through time, that when you resolve a pattern, you resolve it for your ancestors who couldn't and for your descendants who won't have to. Reason 4. Karmic pattern breaking. Whether you believe in literal reincarnation or see karma as metaphor for intergenerational trauma, the principle is the same. Families repeat patterns until someone conscious enough is born to break the cycle. Alcoholism, abuse, emotional unavailability, narcissism. These patterns can run through families for generations, each new generation unconsciously reproducing what they experienced, passing the wound forward like a toxic inheritance. Then an empath is born, someone whose nervous system is too sensitive to numb themselves the way previous generations did, someone who can't not feel the pain. Someone who, precisely because they're too sensitive to pretend, becomes the circuit breaker for the entire lineage. You're that person, your sensitivity, the thing your family shamed you for, the thing you've spent years trying to reduce or manage or medicate. That's your superpower for this mission. You had to feel the full weight of the ancestral wound. You had to experience it so completely that you couldn't deny it, couldn't rationalize it, couldn't pass it forward unconsciously. And when you choose to heal, when you do the therapy, the shadow work, the boundary setting, the terrifying act of breaking family loyalty by refusing to perpetuate the dysfunction, you're not just helping yourself. You're completing a soul-level assignment that your ancestors couldn't complete. You're the one who finally says, "This ends with me. I will not pass this wound forward. I will feel it fully, integrate it consciously, and transform it." Reason 5. Compassion forging. There's a kind of compassion that comes from theory, from reading about suffering, from watching documentaries, from intellectually understanding that pain exists in the world. It's a good compassion, a necessary compassion, but it's thin. It doesn't go deep enough to truly hold another's pain without trying to fix it, without collapsing into it, without turning away when it gets too intense. Then there's the compassion that comes from direct experience, from knowing suffering intimately, from having lived inside pain so profound that you understand, in your body and bones, what it means to barely survive. This is the compassion Jung called the wounded healer's gift, the capacity to sit with another's suffering without needing to rescue them, without trying to make it go away, without being destroyed by proximity to their pain. Empaths in toxic families are being forged in this second kind of compassion. Every moment you sat with your mother's depression, unable to fix it but refusing to abandon her, you were developing this capacity. Every time you held space for your father's rage, neither attacking back nor running away, you were building this muscle. Every relationship where you stayed present with someone's chaos without absorbing it as your own, you were training for sacred work. This is why so many empaths become therapists, healers, coaches, teachers, not because we're trying to fix our own wounds by proxy, though that's part of the journey, but because we have the capacity, earned through brutal experience, to be with suffering in a way that most people can't. We can hold the darkness without becoming it. We can witness pain without drowning in it. We can love broken people without believing we have to break ourselves to save them. That's not something you can learn in graduate school. It's forged in the crucible of family trauma, and it's precisely why you had to experience what you experienced. Reason 6. Initiation into non-ordinary reality. Jung's most radical idea, the one that got him dismissed by mainstream psychology, was that the psyche isn't confined to the personal ego. There are deeper layers, what he called the collective unconscious, and beyond that, realms of consciousness that can only be accessed through non-rational means. Dreams, visions, synchronicities, what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to perceive reality beyond the ordinary, mechanistic, rational worldview. Toxic families, in their dysfunction, create such surreal emotional realities that children raised in them develop this transcendent function by necessity. When your mother tells you she loves you while her face radiates hatred, you learn to trust non-verbal reality over words. When your family insists everything is fine, while the house vibrates with unspoken rage, you learn to sense invisible fields. When you can feel your father's mood from 3 rooms away, you're developing psychic perception. Most people never develop these capacities because they're raised in environments congruent enough that ordinary perception works fine. But you were raised in a house of mirrors where nothing was what it claimed to be, where the spoken and unspoken were in constant contradiction. You had to learn to navigate by feeling, by sensing, by trusting non-rational knowing. You became, in Jung's terms, initiated into non-ordinary reality. This is why so many empaths who heal from their childhood trauma find themselves drawn to spirituality, to mysticism, to depth psychology. It's not escapism, it's recognition. You're remembering that you've always been able to perceive more than the surface, that your sensitivity isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's your access point to dimensions of reality that most people don't even know exist. Your toxic family, in trying to break you, actually broke you open to consciousness most humans never touch. And while the price was terrible, the gift, if you claim it, is extraordinary. Pause for a moment. Which of these 6 reasons resonates most deeply in your bones? Which one feels like it's describing your specific assignment? Comment the number 1 through 6 and trust that your answer reveals something about your soul's specific curriculum. There's no right answer, there's only your answer. and in naming it, you're beginning to claim it. But before we go further, I need to give you a warning. This knowledge, this understanding that empaths choose toxic families for spiritual purposes can be weaponized. And I've seen it happen in two devastating ways. First, empaths can use it to bypass necessary healing. I chose this for my soul's growth, so I shouldn't complain. I should just accept it and be grateful for the lesson. This is spiritual bypassing, using higher concepts to avoid lower wounds. Listen carefully. Understanding the spiritual purpose of your childhood doesn't erase the need for grief, rage, boundary setting, and healing. Both truths exist simultaneously. You were on a sacred mission and you were genuinely harmed. You came here for soul-level growth and you deserved better. Hold both. Don't let the spiritual meaning become a reason to silence your human pain. Second, and more insidious, abusers can weaponize this framework. You needed this for your growth. I was teaching you a lesson. You're stronger because of what I did to you. This is narcissistic distortion of spiritual truth. No, abuse is never justified, ever. The fact that you were able to extract meaning from your suffering doesn't mean the suffering was necessary, or that the abusers were serving some higher purpose. They were unconscious. They caused damage, and they're accountable for that damage, regardless of what you've managed to alchemize from it. Jung was explicit about this in his shadow work. We must face both the spiritual meaning and the human damage. We don't get to skip either side. The work requires holding paradox, that your childhood had profound spiritual purpose and that you were genuinely victimized, that you're being called to something sacred, and that you need boundaries, therapy, and possibly estrangement from family members who remain toxic, that you can honor the initiation and demand that abuse stop. This isn't easy thinking. Most people want one or the other, either pure victimhood or pure spiritual enlightenment. But Jung's psychology demands we hold both, that we live in the tension between human hurt and soul purpose. If you use this teaching to stay in abusive situations, you've missed the point. If you use it to justify never healing, you've betrayed your assignment. The knowledge that you chose this family doesn't mean you should stay in dysfunction. It means you're strong enough to leave it, heal from it, and transform it. Understood? Good. Because what comes next requires both your spiritual awareness and your human discernment. Let's continue. Now we come to the map, the territory you've been wandering through without knowing there was a path. Jung called this journey individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are beneath all the conditioning, all the masks, all the roles you've played to survive. For empaths emerging from toxic families, this journey has 4 distinct stages. Knowing which stage you're in changes everything. It helps you stop judging yourself for where you are and start working with the transformation that's trying to happen through you. Stage 1. The unconscious servant. This is where almost all empaths begin. You're so completely identified with the helper role that you don't even know you're playing a role. It's not a mask you put on, it's who you believe you are. The good child, the peacemaker, the one who takes care of everyone, the emotional thermostat of the family. You have no awareness that you're different from anyone else. You assume everyone feels what you feel, senses what you sense, carries what you carry. Jung called this state persona possession, when the mask you wear for the world fuses with your identity so completely that there's no conscious self underneath it anymore. You are the helper. You are the caretaker. You are the one who makes sure everyone else is okay. And when someone asks, "But what about you? What do you need?" the question barely makes sense. Your needs are everyone else's needs. Your happiness is everyone else's happiness. Their pain is your pain. Their joy is your joy. Jung called this participation mystique, a state of complete merger with the collective, where there are no clear boundaries between self and other. The lived experience is this. You're exhausted, but you can't name why. You give endlessly in relationships and receive crumbs, but you tell yourself that's fine because giving is who you are. You walk into rooms and immediately start managing everyone's emotional state without consciously choosing to. Your body keeps score, though. Migraines, digestive issues, autoimmune conditions, chronic fatigue. These are your psyche's way of screaming what your conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. You're carrying weight that isn't yours, and it's crushing you. This stage can last decades. Some empaths never leave it. They live their entire lives as unconscious servants, dying never knowing who they might have been if they'd put themselves first even once. But if you're watching this, you're probably not in this stage anymore. Or you're at its edge, starting to feel the first cracks in the identity you've built your entire life around. Stage 2, the awakening crisis. Something breaks. It's different for everyone, but the pattern is similar. Maybe it's a betrayal. The person you gave everything to leaves or reveals they were using you all along. Maybe it's a breakdown. Your body or mind simply can't hold the weight anymore and collapses. Maybe it's an accumulation of smaller moments where you suddenly see the pattern you've been enacting your whole life. Or maybe it's just a moment of devastating clarity where you look at your life and realize, I have given everything to everyone else, and I have nothing left for myself. Jung called this the encounter with the shadow. You're suddenly seeing all the parts of reality you've been denying. You recognize, perhaps for the first time, that your family used you as an emotional dumpster, that your gift for reading people was actually a survival adaptation developed to avoid abuse, that every relationship you've chosen has been with people who need fixing because being needed is the only way you know how to feel valuable, that your sensitivity has been exploited, your empathy weaponized against you. This stage is excruciating. The old self, the helper, the servant, the giver, is dying, but the new self hasn't formed yet. You're in what Jung called the negredo, the blackening, the dark night where everything you believed about yourself dissolves. You might experience intense rage at everyone you've served, crushing grief for the life you've lost while taking care of others, suicidal ideation because if you're not the helper, who are you? If your value isn't in giving endlessly, what value do you have? Many empaths get stuck in this stage, cycling between awareness and denial. They see the truth, feel the rage, then immediately feel guilty and slide back into the servant role. Maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe I'm being selfish. This cycling can last years. The way out isn't through more understanding, it's through action, through doing something radically different, even when it terrifies you. Stage 3, the separation and boundary building. If you survive stage 2 without returning to unconscious servitude, you enter the hermit phase. This is where empaths do something that looks cruel to everyone who's been feeding off their energy. They withdraw, sometimes dramatically, no contact with family, friendship purges, relationship endings, moving to a new city. Precisely why you had to experience what you experienced. Reason 6. Initiation into non-ordinary reality. Jung's most radical idea, the one that got him dismissed by mainstream psychology, was that the psyche isn't confined to the personal ego. There are deeper layers, what he called the collective unconscious, and beyond that, realms of consciousness that can only be accessed through non-rational means. Dreams, visions, synchronicities, what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to perceive reality beyond the ordinary, mechanistic, rational worldview. Toxic families, in their dysfunction, create such surreal emotional realities that children raised in them develop this transcendent function by necessity. When your mother tells you she loves you while her face radiates hatred, you learn to trust non-verbal reality over words. When your family insists everything is fine, While the house vibrates with unspoken rage, you learn to sense invisible fields. When you can feel your father's mood from 3 rooms away, you're developing psychic perception. Most people never develop these capacities because they're raised in environments congruent enough that ordinary perception works fine. But you were raised in a house of mirrors where nothing was what it claimed to be, where the spoken and unspoken were in constant contradiction. You had to learn to navigate by feeling, by sensing, by trusting non-rational knowing. You became, in Jung's terms, initiated into non-ordinary reality. This is why so many empaths who heal from their childhood trauma find themselves drawn to spirituality, to mysticism, to depth psychology. It's not escapism, it's recognition. You're remembering that you've always been able to perceive more than the surface, that your sensitivity isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's your access point to dimensions of reality that most people don't even know exist. Your toxic family, in trying to break you, actually broke you open to consciousness most humans never touch. And while the price was terrible, the gift, if you claim it, is extraordinary. Pause for a moment. Which of these 6 reasons resonates most deeply in your bones? Which one feels like it's describing your specific assignment? Comment the number 1 through 6 and trust that your answer reveals something about your soul's specific curriculum. There's no right answer, there's only your answer, and in naming it, you're beginning to claim it. But before we go further, I need to give you a warning. This knowledge, this understanding that empaths choose toxic families for spiritual purposes can be weaponized. And I've seen it happen in 2 devastating ways. First, empaths can use it to bypass necessary healing. I chose this for my soul's growth, so I shouldn't complain. I should just accept it and be grateful for the lesson. This is spiritual bypassing, using higher concepts to avoid lower wounds. Listen carefully. Understanding the spiritual purpose of your childhood doesn't erase the need for grief, rage, boundary setting, and healing. Both truths exist simultaneously. You were on a sacred mission and you were genuinely harmed. You came here for soul-level growth and you deserved better. Hold both. Don't let the spiritual meaning become a reason to silence your human pain. Second, and more insidious, abusers can weaponize this framework. You needed this for your growth. I was teaching you a lesson. You're stronger because of what I did to you. This is narcissistic distortion of spiritual truth. No, abuse is never justified, ever. The fact that you were able to extract meaning from your suffering doesn't mean the suffering was necessary, or that the abusers were serving some higher purpose. They were unconscious. They caused damage, and they're accountable for that damage, regardless of what you've managed to alchemize from it. Jung was explicit about this in his shadow work. We must face both the spiritual meaning and the human damage. We don't get to skip either side. The work requires holding paradox, that your childhood had profound spiritual purpose and that you were genuinely victimized, that you're being called to something sacred, and that you need boundaries, therapy, and possibly estrangement from family members who remain toxic, that you can honor the initiation and demand that abuse stop. This isn't easy thinking. Most people want one or the other, either pure victimhood or pure spiritual enlightenment. But Jung's psychology demands we hold both, that we live in the tension between human hurt and soul purpose. If you use this teaching to stay in abusive situations, you've missed the point. If you use it to justify never healing, you've betrayed your assignment. The knowledge that you chose this family doesn't mean you should stay in dysfunction. It means you're strong enough to leave it, heal from it, and transform it. Understood? Good. Because what comes next requires both your spiritual awareness and your human discernment. Let's continue. Now we come to the map, the territory you've been wandering through without knowing there was a path. Jung called this journey individuation. the process of becoming who you actually are beneath all the conditioning, all the masks, all the roles you've played to survive. For empaths emerging from toxic families, this journey has 4 distinct stages. Knowing which stage you're in changes everything. It helps you stop judging yourself for where you are and start working with the transformation that's trying to happen through you. Stage 1. The unconscious servant. This is where almost all empaths begin. You're so completely identified with the helper role that you don't even know you're playing a role. It's not a mask you put on, it's who you believe you are. The good child, the peacemaker, the one who takes care of everyone, the emotional thermostat of the family. You have no awareness that you're different from anyone else. You assume everyone feels what you feel, senses what you sense, carries what you carry. Jung called this state persona possession, when the mask you wear for the world fuses with your identity so completely that there's no conscious self underneath it anymore. You are the helper, you are the caretaker, you are the one who makes sure everyone else is okay. And when someone asks, "But what about you? What do you need?" the question barely makes sense. Your needs are everyone else's needs. Your happiness is everyone else's happiness. Their pain is your pain. Their joy is your joy. Jung called this participation mystique, a state of complete merger with the collective where there are no clear boundaries between self and other. The lived experience is this: you're exhausted, but you can't name why. You give endlessly in relationships and receive crumbs, but you tell yourself that's fine because giving is who you are. You walk into rooms and immediately start managing everyone's emotional state without consciously choosing to. Your body keeps score, though. Migraines, digestive issues, autoimmune conditions, chronic fatigue. These are your psyche's way of screaming what your conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. You're carrying weight that isn't yours, and it's crushing you. This stage can last decades. Some empaths never leave it. They live their entire lives as unconscious servants, dying never knowing who they might have been if they'd put themselves first even once. But if you're watching this, you're probably not in this stage anymore. Or you're at its edge, starting to feel the first cracks in the identity you've built your entire life around. Stage 2. The awakening crisis. Something breaks. It's different for everyone, but the pattern is similar. Maybe it's a betrayal. The person you gave everything to leaves or reveals they were using you all along. Maybe it's a breakdown. Your body or mind simply can't hold the weight anymore and collapses. Maybe it's an accumulation of smaller moments where you suddenly see the pattern you've been enacting your whole life. Or maybe it's just a moment of devastating clarity where you look at your life and realize, I have given everything to everyone else, and I have nothing left for myself. Jung called this the encounter with the shadow. You're suddenly seeing all the parts of reality you've been denying. You recognize, perhaps for the first time, that your family used you as an emotional dumpster, that your gift for reading people was actually a survival adaptation developed to avoid abuse, that every relationship you've chosen has been with people who need fixing because being needed is the only way you know how to feel valuable, that your sensitivity has been exploited, your empathy weaponized against you. This stage is excruciating. The old self, the helper, the servant, the giver, is dying, but the new self hasn't formed yet. You're in what Jung called the negredo, the blackening, the dark night where everything you believed about yourself dissolves. You might experience intense rage at everyone you've served, crushing grief for the life you've lost while taking care of others, suicidal ideation because if you're not the helper, who are you? If your value isn't in giving endlessly, what value do you have? Many empaths get stuck in this stage, cycling between awareness and denial. They see the truth, feel the rage, then immediately feel guilty and slide back into the servant role. Maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe I'm being selfish. This cycling can last years. The way out isn't through more understanding, it's through action, through doing something radically different, even when it terrifies you. Stage 3. The separation and boundary building. If you survive Stage 2 without returning to unconscious servitude, you enter the hermit phase. This is where empaths do something that looks cruel to everyone who's been feeding off their energy. They withdraw, sometimes dramatically, no contact with family, friendship purges, relationship endings, moving to a new city.